The morning they auctioned her father's farm, Abigail Carter did not cry. She stood at the fence post with her mother's recipe journal pressed against her chest and watched strangers carry away every chair, every quilt, every cast-iron pot her family had owned for 30 years. When the auctioneer called the final number, she turned without a word, picked up her suitcase, and walked away from the only life she had ever known. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she still had the recipe, and her mother always said a good pie could open any door. If this story already has you feeling something, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one is going to take a while, and every single minute of it is worth your time. The road into Red Creek Ranch was not the kind of road that welcomed strangers. It was rutted deep by wagon wheels, flanked on both sides by dormant grassland that had gone brown and brittle under a Colorado autumn that arrived early and stayed mean. The sky overhead was the color of pewter flat, and low pressing down on the land, like a hand trying to smother something. The cottonwood trees along the creek had already surrendered their leaves, and what remained of them rattled and scraped in a wind that had teeth in it. Abigail Carter walked that road with her suitcase in one hand and a cloth-wrapped bundle in the other. The suitcase was small and battered, its leather cracked at both corners, and held together on one side with a strip of rawhide. She had knotted herself 3 days earlier, when the original strap gave out somewhere between Crestwood and the county road. Inside it were 2 dresses, a wool underskirt, a change of stockings, her mother's recipe journal, the handwritten one, with the blue cover warped from years of kitchen steam, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a flour sack, a round pie tin that had belonged to her grandmother. The cloth-wrapped bundle was the pie tin's contents: apple, cinnamon, brown sugar, and a pinch of clove, because her mother always said clove was the secret the recipe never admitted to. She had baked it the night before in the cold kitchen of a boarding house in Crestwood, using the last of her flour, the last of her sugar, and 4 apples. She had traded her good hair ribbon to get from a farm wife who felt sorry for her, and then immediately looked away, because sorry only goes so far when you have your own family to feed. Abigail had not eaten since the previous morning. She did not eat the pie. The pie was not for her. She had learned that lesson from her mother, who had lived by it until the very end. You bake for others first. You give what you have. The rest has a way of returning. Abigail was 24 years old, and she had been living by that philosophy for 2 months now, since the drought finally finished, what 3 bad seasons had started, and the bank came for the farm, with a finality that left no room for argument. Her father had signed the papers without looking up from the table. He was not a man who cried, but his hands shook as he held the pen, and Abigail had put her hand over his and held it steady. And he had not thanked her, because neither of them had words for what that moment was. He died 6 weeks later. The doctor called it his heart. Abigail called it grief. Either way, he was gone, and she was alone, and the farm was gone, and the life she had known was gone, and all she had left in the world was a suitcase, a recipe journal, a pie tin, and enough stubbornness to keep moving forward when every sensible reason to do so had been stripped away. She had heard about Red Creek Ranch from a man at the livery stable in Crestwood, who told her Luke Walker was looking for a cook. He said it like it was common knowledge, like posting a notice on the church door, offhand and unremarkable. She had asked him twice to confirm it. He'd looked at her the second time with something between pity and amusement. "He's been through 4 cooks in 2 years, the man said. First one quit because the hands were too rough. Second one left when he cut her wages in November. Third one, well..." He paused. "Luke Walker ain't exactly what you'd call an easy man to work for." "What about the 4th?" Abigail asked. "Married one of the hands and moved to Denver." He shrugged. "Place is a mess. Kitchen's barely functional. Ranch hand's been eating salt pork and burned beans for 6 weeks. Abigail thanked him and asked him how far it was to Red Creek Ranch. 8 miles, he said, give or take. She walked all 8 of them. The gate to Red Creek Ranch was made of iron and wood, heavy and functional, with the ranch name burned into a crossbeam overhead in letters that had weathered to a dark gray. It was not elegant. It was not meant to be. It was the kind of gate that said, "This place works for a living." Everything beyond it confirmed that impression. The main house was large but plain, its paint peeling in long strips from the siding, a porch with 2 broken boards, a chimney that breathed thin smoke into the flat gray sky. The outbuildings were in better condition than the house, which told Abigail something about the man who owned it. He prioritized function over appearance, cattle over comfort, business over sentiment. She had barely passed through the gate when the first man noticed her. He was young, maybe 20, leaning against a fence post and working something in his teeth with a splinter of wood. He stared at her with open curiosity, the way a person stares at something that doesn't quite belong in the frame. "Help you," he said, though his tone made clear he wasn't certain he meant it. "I'm looking for Mr. Walker," Abigail said. "I heard he's looking for a cook." The young man looked at her worn coat, her cracked suitcase, her cloth-wrapped bundle, and he took his time doing it. Then he turned his head and called toward the barn. Hey, Colton, come look at this." Another man emerged from the barn door, older with a red beard and a slow walk that suggested he had learned long ago that hurrying was rarely worth the effort. He came to the fence and looked at Abigail with the same frank assessment the younger man had used, except his eyes were sharper and his expression more complicated. "You're applying for the cook position," he said. "Yes, sir." "How old are you?" 24. "You got experience." "I cooked for my family's farm for 6 years," she said. "And I've read every cookbook my mother owned, and I can stretch a side of salt pork into 5 different meals, and I can bake bread in a Dutch oven if the wood stove isn't available." Colton looked at the younger man. The younger man looked back at him. Something passed between them that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite dismissal. It was the particular expression of men who have been disappointed enough times that they no longer invest in the possibility of good surprises. "Boss is up at the house," Colton said finally. "He'll tell you himself whether he's interested. I wouldn't get your hopes up, miss." "Thank you," Abigail said. "And I'd knock loud," he added as she turned away. "He don't always come to the door for quiet knocking." She knocked loud. The door was opened by a man who clearly had not expected company and showed it. Luke Walker was 36 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of jaw that always looked like it was carrying an argument it hadn't finished yet. He was in his shirt sleeves, no jacket, a coffee mug in one hand, and a ledger book tucked under his other arm. And he looked at Abigail the way a man looks at something that has interrupted a thought he needed to finish. "Whatever you're selling," he said, "I don't need it." "I'm not selling anything," Abigail said. "I'm applying for the cook position." He looked at her. His eyes moved to her suitcase, to the cloth bundle she was still carrying. "Who told you I was looking?" "Man at the livery in Crestwood." "Tom Garrett." "He didn't give his name." Luke Walker looked at her for a long moment. "You walk all the way out here?" "Yes, sir." "That's 8 miles." "I know." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How old are you?" 24. "Previous employment?" I managed the kitchen for my family's farm for 6 years. We fed 8 hands through 3 harvest seasons." "Ranch cooking is different from farm cooking." "I'm a quick study," she said. Another silence. He was not a man who filled silences out of social obligation. She could see that immediately. He used them the way other men used words, deliberately, as a tool, watching to see what the other person did inside them. Abigail stood still. She did not fidget. She did not look away. Luke Walker looked at the cloth bundle. "What's that?" "Apple pie," she said. "I baked it this morning." Something moved across his face. Not quite an expression, more like the echo of one. "Why'd you bring a pie to a job interview?" "Because anyone can say they can cook," Abigail said. "I thought it might be more useful to demonstrate it." He was quiet for another moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house told the same story as the outside, only louder. The front room was functional and spare nothing on the walls, except a calendar 2 months out of date and a rack of pegs holding coats and hats. The furniture was heavy and plain, chosen for durability rather than any notion of comfort. There was a writing desk covered in papers, and the ledger book he'd been carrying presumably belonged there. Everything about the room said a man lives here alone, and has for long enough that he's stopped noticing what's missing. The kitchen was worse. Abigail didn't say anything when she saw it. She had been raised by a woman who believed that the first response to a bad situation was assessment, not complaint, so she simply looked. The wood stove was functional, but needed cleaning badly. There was grease built up on the cooking surface, and the flue handle was bent at an angle that suggested someone had forced it at some point. The pantry had adequate supplies, but poor organization, things stacked without logic. Flour and sugar in unlabeled sacks, cured meat hanging, but not properly covered. The dish shelf had 3 mismatched plates, 2 tin cups, and a single good china bowl that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Luke Walker stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her look at it. "I know it's not in good order," he said. "How long since you had a cook?" 6 weeks. "What have the men been eating?" "Salt pork, beans, whatever Colton manages, and Colton manages poorly." "I see." She set her suitcase down. She set the cloth bundle carefully on the table. "Do you have a knife that's properly sharpened?" He blinked. "Probably not." "A sharpening stone?" "Somewhere." "May I use your kitchen?" He stared at her. "Right now." "I have a pie that needs slicing," she said. "And your stove needs to be fired properly before anything useful can be done with it. And I'd rather do it myself than explain to someone else how. If you're going to decide whether to hire me, you might as well decide based on something real." Luke Walker was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to the woodpile beside the stove and began setting kindling without a word. She took that for permission. She found the sharpening stone in the 3rd drawer she opened. She found a serviceable knife behind it. She unwrapped the pie, and the smell of cinnamon and warm apple, and something indefinably domestic moved through the kitchen, like something that belonged there, like it had been missing for a long time, and had simply now found its way back. Luke Walker stoked the fire. He did not look at the pie. But he did not leave the kitchen either. She sliced 2 pieces. She set one on the better of the 2 plates she could find and put it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. "Eat it while it's still got some warmth," she said. "Cold pie's fine, but warm is better." He sat down. He picked up the fork. He took a bite. Abigail stood at the stove and did not watch him eat, because her mother had taught her that too. You don't stand over someone and wait for their reaction. You give them the food and let them have it privately. The eating is theirs. The making is yours. But she heard him set his fork down after the first bite, and pick it up again. And she heard the rhythm of a man eating not out of obligation, but out of something that had caught him off guard. He was quiet for a long time. "What do you want for wages?" he said finally. Abigail told him. He didn't argue. He didn't counter. He looked at her across the kitchen for a moment, and whatever he was looking for, she must have passed the test, because he said, "You start tomorrow morning. There's a room off the back of the kitchen, small, but it's got a door that latches." "Thank you, Mr. Walker." "Luke," he said. "Nobody calls me Mr. Walker unless they're trying to sell me something or sue me." He pushed back from the table and picked up his ledger. "Breakfast is at 6. The hands eat before they work. They work hard, and they'll need real food, not what Colton's been putting in front of them." He stopped in the doorway. "And Miss Carter," she said. "Abigail Carter. Miss Carter, don't make promises about what this kitchen can do until you know what it can do. I'd rather be surprised than disappointed again." He left. Abigail stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. She looked at the wood stove, the disorganized pantry, the bent flue handle, the single good china bowl on the shelf. She looked at the 2 empty plates on the table and the half-finished slice of pie on his. He'd eaten almost all of it. She allowed herself one small moment of something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, something quieter than either of those things. Then she rolled up her sleeves and began to clean the stove. She worked until after dark. When she finally went to the small room off the back of the kitchen and latched the door behind her, she was so tired she could feel it in the backs of her hands. But the wood stove was clean, the pantry was sorted, the knife was sharp, and she had already planned tomorrow morning's breakfast down to the last detail. She put her mother's recipe journal on the small shelf above the bed. She put the pie tin on the floor beside her suitcase. She lay down in the dark with her coat over her, because there was no extra blanket and she was asleep before she had time to be afraid. The next morning she was up before 5. She had learned that from her father, who believed that the first hour of the morning belonged to whoever was willing to claim it, and everything built after that rested on what you did in that first hour. She got the wood stove going, reorganized the pantry. The rest of the way took stock of what was genuinely usable and what needed to be thrown out, and by 5:30 she had biscuit dough mixed, a pot of oat porridge going, and a full side of bacon sliced and waiting. At 6 o'clock, the hands came in. There were 9 of them. They came through the back door in boots and cold weather gear, talking in that low morning way that men do when the day hasn't quite agreed to start yet, and they pulled up short when they saw the table. It was set, not elaborately. There was nothing fancy about it. But there were enough plates for every man, and there were biscuits in a cloth-lined basket, and there was oat porridge with a crock of honey beside it, and there was bacon laid out in proper strips, rather than Colton's method of heaping it in a pile, and there was a pot of coffee already brewed and a second one warming. The youngest hand, the same boy who'd called Colton over when she arrived, stopped in the doorway and stared at the table like he wasn't sure it was real. "Sit down," Abigail said without looking up from the stove where she was keeping the bacon warm. "Coffee's hot. Don't let it go cold while you stand there looking at it." They sat. It was not a complicated meal. It was not a remarkable meal by any measure she would have applied to herself. But it was real hot, abundant food, and she could tell by the way the men ate that they had been running on short rations for longer than 6 weeks. There was a kind of focused gratitude in the way they worked through the biscuits, not wasteful, not rushed, but deliberate, like men who had been reminded of something they'd started to forget. Colton, the red-bearded man, looked at her from across the table about halfway through the meal. "Where'd you learn to make biscuits like this?" he said. "My mother," Abigail said. "She a good cook. She was the best cook I've ever known." He nodded slowly. "Was," he said. "Yes," she said. "She passed 2 years ago. I didn't offer condolences." He just nodded again, and there was something in it that was more respectful than any formal expression of sympathy would have been. "Your mother teach you everything you know. Everything worth knowing," Abigail said. Luke Walker came in late 6:10 and took his place at the head of the table without fanfare. He poured his own coffee. He helped himself to biscuits and porridge and bacon, with the efficiency of a man who eats to work rather than for pleasure. He did not look at Abigail, but halfway through his meal he paused. He looked at his plate. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it. "Good," he said. It was one word. He said it to no one in particular, or to the room in general, or perhaps to himself. But Abigail heard it, and she turned back to the stove, and she permitted herself that same quiet thing she'd felt the evening before. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. Something that felt like proof that the road here had been worth walking. The days began to find their rhythm. Abigail was methodical in the way she worked, and methodical in the way she learned. She spent the first week doing nothing but cooking and watching what the men ate and what they left watching, when hunger peaked and when energy flagged, watching what the ranch's supply situation actually was versus what the pantry inventory suggested. She asked Colton careful questions about the supply rotation, about how the previous cooks had handled the winter stores, about what Luke liked and what he refused. Colton answered most of her questions. He was not a warm man, but he was a fair one, and he seemed to have decided somewhere in that first breakfast that she was worth his honesty. "He don't like anything sweet at dinner," Colton said one afternoon when she asked. "Says it makes a man soft for the afternoon work. But—" He paused, as if he was revealing something he wasn't entirely sure he should. "He don't say no to it in the evenings. After supper when the books are out. That's when he'll take something." "What about the men?" she asked. "What do they miss most?" Colton thought about it. "Sunday cooking," he said finally. "When my mother was alive, she cooked Sundays different, took her time, made things that weren't about fuel, if you understand me. Things that were about just being at home." Abigail understood perfectly. That Sunday she baked 2 pies. She used dried cherries she found in the back of the pantry, reconstituted them in a little brandy she found in the same location, and made a cherry pie with a proper lattice top. The kind that took time, the kind her mother had only made on special occasions, because the technique required patience. The second pie was apple again because she had a feeling about apple. She set them on the table after Sunday supper without announcement. The reaction was not dramatic. Men who work the land don't tend toward drama. But there was a shift in the room, a kind of collective exhale, a slowing down. Hands that had been ready to push back from the table stayed at it. The young hand, whose name she had learned was Jesse, looked at the cherry pie for a long moment before cutting himself a slice, and when he tasted it, his expression did something private and unguarded that she looked away from out of courtesy. "My grandmother used to make something like this," said a tall man named Davis, who spoke so rarely that when he did, the table generally noticed. "Not exactly like this, but close." "What did she put in hers?" Abigail asked. Davis thought. "Nutmeg," he said, "and a little orange peel. She said it made it taste like Christmas even when it wasn't." "I'll remember that," Abigail said, "for next time." Davis looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. He nodded once, finished his slice, and cut himself a second. Luke Walker took a piece of apple pie and stood in the doorway rather than sitting. He ate it standing. He did not explain why, and no one asked. He looked out through the door at the last light going out of the sky, eating his pie with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to consume things quickly before circumstances took them away. He took a second slice. He still didn't sit down, but he stayed in the doorway a long time after his plate was empty, and he did not seem to be looking at the sky anymore. He seemed to be listening to the men at the table, their low conversation, the specific ease of men who have eaten well and are in no hurry to move. And something in his face was doing something complicated that Abigail kept her eyes away from, because it was the kind of thing a person doesn't always know you're seeing. She began to understand him in pieces. Luke Walker was not a cold man. He had the manner of one, the economy of expression, the preference for action over statement, the instinct to frame every problem in terms of what needed to be done about it rather than how he felt about it. But underneath that was something she recognized, the particular quality of a person who has cared deeply and been hurt by it, and has decided not consciously, but absolutely, that caring and hurting are inseparable, and if you want to avoid one, you have to wall off the other. She had felt something like it herself in the weeks after her father died, when the grief was so close to the surface that she had to keep moving to stay ahead of it. She didn't say any of this. It wasn't her place, and it wasn't something he would have welcomed. But she filed it away in the part of herself where she kept things she understood and didn't need to speak aloud. By the third week, Luke had developed the habit of stopping in the kitchen in the late evening. It started with coffee. He would come in after the ledger work, pour himself a cup, stand at the counter, and drink it in the way men drink the last coffee of the day, not savoring it, just completing it, a kind of period at the end of the day's sentence. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Sometimes he said something brief about the next day's work, a supply order he needed to place, a fence line that needed repair, a weather report from a neighbor that concerned him. Abigail answered when he spoke, and did not press him when he didn't. She went about her own evening tasks, setting bread to rise, prepping tomorrow's breakfast, mending the one apron she owned. One evening in the fourth week, he came in and poured his coffee, and then instead of standing at the counter, he sat down at the kitchen table. Just like that. No explanation. He sat down, opened his ledger, and began to work. Abigail looked at the back of his head for exactly 1 second, and then went back to her bread dough. It became the pattern. He worked at the kitchen table in the evenings. She prepared for the next morning. Neither of them made a declaration about it. It simply became a fact of the household, quiet and functional and unremarkable on its surface, except that it was not unremarkable. Not to Abigail, because she knew what it meant when a solitary person chose to do their solitary work in the same room as another person rather than alone. It didn't mean anything romantic. She was clear with herself about that. It meant he was tired of the particular kind of silence that lives in rooms where nobody else is. She understood that too. In early November, the first hard frost arrived. Abigail had anticipated it. She had spent the previous 2 weeks putting up vegetables, working with the kitchen garden's last yield, blanching and jarring beans, drying onions and garlic, putting up the last of the apples in both dried slices and jar form. She had enlisted Jessie, who turned out to have a patient hand and a genuine willingness to learn things to help with the canning. By the time the frost hit, the kitchen pantry was organized, stocked and ready for a hard winter, in a way it had not been in years. Luke came in from a morning ride and went to the pantry, as he occasionally did, to check something about the supply situation. He stood in the pantry doorway for a long moment. He came back into the kitchen. "When did you do all this?" he asked. "Over the past 2 weeks," Abigail said. "I had Jessie help with the canning." "Jessie doesn't know anything about canning." "He does now," she said. "He's a quick study when someone explains the reason behind the task." Luke looked at her. "How far through winter will what you've got in there carry us?" "If I'm careful about it, and if we supplement with game as the men bring it in through March, possibly into April." He was quiet. "Previous cook bought everything from the supply store in town," Abigail said, because she'd learned from Colton what the previous supply arrangement had been and the expense of it. That's sustainable when times are good, and a serious problem when credit is tight. Luke's jaw did the thing it did when he was holding something in a slight tightening a shift. "You know about the credit situation. I know supply costs and the size of this operation don't match the income I can see coming in from the basic herd count. I'm not a banker, Mr. Luke, but I know what it looks like when a kitchen is being run on a margin that doesn't allow for bad luck." He looked at her for a long time. "You've been here less than a month," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you've already figured out the financial situation." "I figured out the kitchen situation," she said. "The financial situation seems to follow from it." Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. Not quite respect. He had shown her practical respect from the beginning, the kind that comes from watching someone work competently. This was different. This was the expression of a man who has been surprised by something he hadn't known to expect. "I'm working on it," he said. "The credit situation." "I know," she said. "I'm not suggesting otherwise." He picked up his coffee cup. Then he said, not looking at her, "The ranch was doing well enough 4 years ago. I bought 200 head of cattle and borrowed to do it. The next winter was the hardest in 20 years. I lost 60 head. He stopped. It's been a recovery process. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her in 4 weeks of kitchen evenings. She could see what it cost him to say it, not much, not to a man like him, but something. "I'm sorry," she said. "That kind of loss is hard to come back from." "You manage," he said. "You do," she agreed. "But that doesn't mean it isn't hard." He was quiet for a moment. "You've had your share of it," he said. "The losing." "Yes," she said. He didn't ask her to elaborate, and she didn't. They understood each other on that point. Some losses are a matter of record, and some losses you carry in the way you move, the way you plan ahead, the way you bake a pie and don't eat it yourself, and walk 8 miles on the chance that it opens a door. That was the evening she understood that something between them had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. It was not romance, she was still clear with herself about that, clear and careful and deliberate. It was the specific gravity of 2 people who have both lost enough that they recognize it in each other, and that recognition creates a kind of weight between them that has nothing to do with intention. She put his coffee cup in the basin and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about her mother's recipe journal, still sitting on the shelf above the bed where she had put it that first night. She thought about the way her mother used to say that food was a language with no barrier, that you could say things with a meal that you could not say with words, and that sometimes people needed to be fed something they couldn't name before they were ready to hear anything at all. She thought about Luke Walker eating that first slice of apple pie in the kitchen doorway, standing alone, looking at the sky. She thought about the way he'd taken a second slice. She fell asleep thinking about what she would bake on Sunday. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall on Red Creek Ranch, covering the rutted road and the bare cottonwoods and the long brown grassland in something quiet and clean, and entirely indifferent to the complicated things happening inside the houses of human beings. The snow fell. The wood stove kept the kitchen warm. And in the small room off the back of the kitchen, Abigail Carter slept soundly for the first time in a very long while with her mother's recipe journal on the shelf above her head, and one more day behind her that she had made into something worth keeping. The snow that fell on Red Creek Ranch that first night did not stop for 3 days. By the time it cleared, Abigail had already remade the kitchen entirely. Not in terms of structure, the walls were where they were. The wood stove was bolted to the floor, but in terms of what the kitchen meant. She had done it quietly without announcement, the way her mother had always done things that mattered. You don't tell people you're changing something. You change it, and you let them notice on their own, because the noticing is the part that sticks. The men noticed. Jesse noticed first, because Jesse was young enough that he still paid attention to the texture of his surroundings, rather than moving through them on habit. He came in one morning in the second week of November, stomping snow from his boots, and stopped just inside the door and looked at the kitchen table, where Abigail had set out coffee and a plate of corn dodgers and a small crock of apple butter she'd made from a batch of dried apples reconstituted overnight. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary. "You put a cloth on the table," he said. "I did," Abigail said. "Where'd you find a cloth?" "I made it. There was a flour sack in the back of the pantry I wasn't going to use for flour." Jesse stared at the cloth. It was plain, unbleached cotton, hemmed simply, but it was there, and it meant something he couldn't quite articulate. He sat down and poured his coffee, and didn't say anything else about it, but he was careful when he set his cup down. The way a person is careful with something they've just decided matters. Colton noticed later that week when he came in from an afternoon of fence mending, and found the kitchen warm and smelling of something that stopped him at the threshold. "What is that?" he said. "Beef and vegetable soup," Abigail said. "I had the neck bones from yesterday's butchering. It seemed wasteful not to use them." Colton hung his hat and coat. "My wife used to make soup like that," he said. "In the winter. It's been a while." He did not say more than that. He did not need to. Luke noticed last, because Luke was a man who had trained himself not to notice things that might require him to respond to them. But one evening in mid-November, he came in from 3 hours of work in the cold barn dealing with a heifer who'd taken sick, and he sat down at the kitchen table with mud on his boots and exhaustion running all the way to the back of his eyes, and Abigail set a bowl of soup in front of him without being asked, and he sat there with his hands around the bowl for a long moment before he picked up the spoon. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The soup was ready," she said. "It made sense to give it to someone who needed it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at the soup. "Heifer's going to make it," he said. "Thought we were going to lose her for a while there." "I'm glad," Abigail said. "Colton thinks it was the cold. Moved too fast this year." He ate. "We can't afford to lose cattle right now." "How many head are you running currently?" He looked up at her. The question surprised him, not its content, but its directness. Previous women in his employ had not asked questions about cattle counts. They had cooked and stayed in their lane. 142 head, he said, down from 200. And the plan is to build that back up. That's the plan, he said. It's a slow plan. Most good plans are, she said. He ate another spoonful and looked at her over the bowl. You think about things like that ranch finances. I think about everything that affects how I do my job, she said. If the ranch is struggling, I need to know it so I can work within those limits instead of against them. I can't plan a kitchen the same way for a prosperous operation as I can for one that's recovering. Luke set his spoon down. How long have you known it was recovering? Since the first day, she said. The pantry told the story clearly enough. He was quiet for the moment. I had a banker come out last week, he said. Harold Whitmore, from the bank in Millhaven. He said the name with a quality in his voice that was not quite contempt, but was adjacent to it. He's had an interest in the ranch's situation for a while now. What kind of interest? Abigail asked. The kind that comes with conditions, Luke said. He picked his spoon back up. He said nothing more about Harold Whitmore that evening, but the name settled in Abigail's mind like a stone dropped in still water, sending rings out in directions she couldn't yet see. The following Sunday she baked 3 pies. It had become an established thing. The Sunday pies and the men had begun to plan around it in the small ways that people plan around things that have become important, without anyone deciding they should be. Jesse would finish his afternoon chores a little faster on Sundays. Davis, the tall, quiet man, would linger over coffee in the way he never did on other evenings. Even Hector, the oldest hand who had worked the ranch for 8 years and maintained a studied indifference to all domestic matters, had been observed twice, moving his chair slightly closer to the kitchen end of the table on Sunday evenings. That particular Sunday, Abigail tried something new. She made a molasses pie, her grandmother's recipe, from the very back of the journal. The one with a note in faded pencil in the margin that said, "For hard times, because it costs almost nothing and gives back a great deal." She made it alongside the apple and alongside a third one. She'd been thinking about for 2 weeks, a sweet potato pie with nutmeg and orange peel. Davis's suggestion from weeks earlier, the one that tasted like Christmas even when it wasn't. She set all 3 on the table after supper. Davis saw his pie and went very still. He looked at it for a long moment. "You remembered," he said. "Nutmeg and orange peel," Abigail said. "Your grandmother's version." Davis looked at her. He was not an emotional man by manner. Hard years and harder work had sanded most visible sentiment from his surface. But his throat moved, and he looked away from her toward the window, and Abigail moved to the stove and found something to do there, so he had a moment's privacy with whatever the pie had brought back to him. "This is the best Sunday I've had in 3 years," Jesse announced from across the table with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of the young, his mouth full of molasses pie. "Don't talk with your mouth full," Colton said. "Sorry." Jesse swallowed. "This is the best Sunday I've had in 3 years." Low laughter moved around the table. Abigail heard it from the stove and felt it in her chest, that specific warmth of a room full of people who have been restored to something they didn't know they were missing. Luke did not sit at the table that Sunday. He came in late after most of the men had begun to drift toward their bunks and found the kitchen quieter only. Colton remaining at the table with the last of his coffee, and Abigail cleaning up. He looked at the 3 pies mostly eaten, one entirely gone, and then he looked at Abigail. "You made 3, he said. "I had the ingredients." "The sweet potato one was Davis's idea," Colton said from behind his coffee cup. Luke looked at Colton, then back at Abigail. "Davis made a suggestion about pie." "About his grandmother's recipe," Abigail said. "I told him I'd try it." Something worked through Luke's expression. He pulled the remaining piece of sweet potato pie toward him, without sitting ate it, standing his established habit, and for a moment said nothing. Then, his grandmother raised him. After his parents died, he hasn't talked about her in years. "He talked about her pie," Abigail said. Luke looked at her. "That's the same thing," he said quietly. He left the kitchen soon after. Colton finished his coffee and stood and reached for his hat, and as he passed her he paused. "What you're doing here," he said. "It's good. I don't want it to go unmentioned." "I'm just cooking," Abigail said. Colton looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "You're not. And I think you know that." He put on his hat and went out. Abigail stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to the wind against the walls. She allowed herself to think for just a moment about what Colton meant. Then she picked up the dishcloth and went back to work. 3 days later, Harold Whitmore rode into Red Creek Ranch. Abigail was in the kitchen yard, bringing in the last of the root vegetables from the cold cellar when his carriage came through the gate, and her first impression was of expense and deliberateness. The carriage was well appointed. The horses matched the driver wore a coat that cost more than Abigail's entire wardrobe. Whitmore himself was a man in his 50s, heavy through the middle, with the groomed confidence of someone who has operated for long enough in a world that accommodates him, that he has forgotten. Accommodation is not the natural state of things. He did not look at Abigail as he passed. She was carrying a basket of turnips and wearing her work apron, and to Harold Whitmore's particular kind of eye, she was furniture. She went inside and put the turnips away, and heard Luke's voice through the wall, the clipped, careful voice he used when he was keeping something back. Whitmore's voice was smoother, the kind of smooth that you only develop through years of practice at making things sound like favors when they're really terms. "The offer stands, Luke," Whitmore was saying. $2,000 to retire the note on the northern grazing land and a line of credit sufficient to rebuild the herd to 300 head. That's more than generous. I'm aware of what it is, Luke said. Then I'm not sure what's giving you pause. The conditions are giving me pause, Luke said. They've been giving me pause since September. A brief silence. Then Whitmore's voice again adjusted slightly softer, with the particular softness of a man rearranging his approach. Victoria is a fine woman. She's educated, she's sensible, she has genuine affection for the territory. She'd make any man a good wife. I don't doubt it, Luke said. She's expressed admiration for this ranch. I know. Then I'm simply asking you to consider the practical benefits of a partnership that would resolve your financial difficulties and provide... I said I'd think about it, Luke said. I'm thinking about it. Whitmore's carriage left an hour later. Luke came into the kitchen that evening and sat at the table without speaking. He didn't open his ledger. He sat with his coffee and looked at the table surface, which he did sometimes when a problem was too large to work through on paper. Abigail set bread to rise and said nothing. After a long while, Luke said, "Did you hear any of that?" "Some," she said. "What did you hear?" "Enough to understand the shape of the offer," she said carefully. And nothing," she said. "It's not my business." "I'm asking your opinion," Luke said. He said it like the words surprised him slightly as he produced them. Abigail was quiet for a moment. She dried her hands on her apron. "I think," she said, "that a man who takes a wife as part of a business arrangement has made a decision about what kind of man he is. And I think you're still figuring out what kind of man you are. So the fact that you haven't said yes yet probably means something." Luke looked at her. "That's a more direct answer than I expected." "You asked for an opinion, not a diplomatic response." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the gesture his face made when something had landed accurately, and he was acknowledging the landing without wanting to make an event of it. He picked up his coffee and looked back at the table. "Victoria Whitmore is coming to the ranch next week," he said. "Her father arranged it. Dinner. Something of a formal visit." Abigail nodded. "I'll prepare something appropriate. I'll need you to..." He stopped. Started again. "I don't need it to be elaborate. I just need it to be, I don't want it to look like the ranch can't." He stopped again. "I understand," she said. "I'll take care of it." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. It came out with a weight to it that had nothing to do with dinner. Victoria Whitmore arrived on a Thursday. She came with a maid and without her father, which surprised Luke and did not surprise Abigail, who had formed a theory about Victoria Whitmore based solely on the efficiency with which her visit had been arranged. A woman who arranges her own travel is not a woman who is simply her father's instrument, whatever the financial arrangement may suggest. Victoria was 28. Dark-haired and dressed with the kind of effortful elegance that speaks to genuine taste rather than mere money. She was not the creature Abigail had privately imagined soft and decorative and indifferent to anything not made of silk. She was observant, sharp. Her eyes moved around the kitchen when she came through the house for a tour and paused on things with the quick focus of someone who is actually seeing rather than performing the act of looking. She looked at the organized pantry, at the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, at the recipe journal on the kitchen shelf. "This is better managed than my father's house," she said. "Thank you," Abigail said. Victoria looked at her directly for the first time. "You've been here how long?" 6 weeks. "And you did all of this in 6 weeks?" "Most of it in the first 2, Abigail said. The rest followed naturally." Victoria studied her for a moment with an expression that was complicated and entirely unreadable. Then she said pleasantly, "My father says you're a very efficient little cook." There it was. Abigail heard it clearly. The possessive efficiency of it, the category it placed her in without hostility or malice, simply as a matter of how Victoria Whitmore's world was organized. You could be good at what you did and still be furniture if the right person was doing the looking. "I try to do my job well," Abigail said pleasantly. The dinner that evening was the finest meal Abigail had produced since arriving at Red Creek Ranch. She had spent 2 days on it, braised beef with wild mushrooms from the cold cellar roasted root vegetables. cornbread made with rendered bacon fat that gave it a depth the standard recipe didn't have. And for dessert, her apple pie made with the particular care she reserved for the times when the stakes of the baking were higher than usual. Victoria's maid served the dining room. Abigail remained in the kitchen. She could hear the conversation through the wall. Luke's measured responses, Victoria's more fluid ones, the way Victoria laughed at something genuine and unguarded. Abigail found herself listening more carefully than she intended to, cataloging things she had no reason to catalog, and she recognized this activity for what it was and made herself stop. She was mixing the glaze for the pie when Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway. "May I?" Victoria said, gesturing toward the kitchen generally, as though asking permission to enter the space. "Of course," Abigail said. Victoria came in. She sat without being invited, without hesitation, at the kitchen table in the chair Luke used. She folded her hands on the surface and looked at Abigail. "I'm going to be direct with you," Victoria said, "because I think you're a direct sort of person." "I try to be," Abigail said. "My father wants this match. He has wanted it for 2 years. He believes it's a sound business arrangement and a respectable social alignment, and he's not wrong on either count." Victoria paused. "What he doesn't understand, because it's not a thing that interests him, is that Luke Walker doesn't want to be saved. He wants to save himself." Abigail looked at her. "I'm not going to marry a man who resents me for being part of the solution to his problems." Victoria continued. "Whatever my father arranges, that's not the kind of life I'm willing to have." She looked at Abigail with that direct, complicated gaze. "I wanted you to know that." "Why?" Abigail said carefully. Victoria glanced toward the dining room, then back at Abigail. "Because," she said, "I have very good instincts about people, and I think Luke Walker has been spending his evenings in this kitchen, and I don't think it's because the coffee is exceptional." Abigail said nothing. Victoria stood. "The dinner was wonderful," she said. "The pie especially. My father ordered an elaborate French pastry from Millhaven last month that cost more than your month's wages. I'd trade it for a slice of that pie without hesitation." She smoothed her dress. "Good night, Miss Carter." She went back to the dining room. Abigail stood at the counter and stared at the pie for a long moment. Then she cut a slice and put it on a plate and set it at Luke's end of the table, as she did every Sunday, as she did whenever the day had been long and something sweet was warranted. She went to bed before the dinner ended. She lay in the dark and thought about what Victoria Whitmore had said, and about what it meant, and about the careful boundary she had built around her own feelings regarding this kitchen and this ranch, and the man who ate standing in the doorway on Sunday evenings. She thought about it for a long time. She did not reach any conclusions. She was not a woman who forced conclusions before the evidence was complete. But she felt the boundary she'd built shifting slightly under a weight she hadn't accounted for, and she noted the shift, the way she noted everything carefully without drama, with the full intention of addressing it in the morning. The morning arrived with a crisis that had nothing to do with feelings. Colton was at her door before 5:30. "Fire," he said. "Hay barn, East End. It's out, we caught it fast, but we lost about a third of the winter feed." Abigail was dressed and in the kitchen within 4 minutes. By the time the men came in for breakfast, she had assessed the situation. A third of the winter feed. In mid-November, with the hardest months still ahead. It was not a catastrophe, not yet, but it had the specific potential of a catastrophe if the winter ran long or the cattle needed more supplemental feeding than projected. She had already begun recalculating. If they reduced the grain supplement for the healthiest cattle and concentrated the remaining feed on the more vulnerable animals, and if the men could source additional hay from neighboring ranches before the roads closed. She was still working through the numbers when Luke came in. He looked at her and read her face before she spoke. "How bad?" he said. "Manageable," she said. "If we act quickly. There are 3 things we can do immediately." He sat down. He listened. It was not her place to manage the ranch's resources. She knew that. But she laid out what she'd calculated the adjusted feeding plan, the neighboring ranches within range for a hay purchase, the cost estimate based on last season's prices, and she did it as efficiently and clearly as she could, and then she stopped talking and let him respond. Luke listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, You worked all that out this morning. Between 4:50 and 5:30, she said. Approximately. How? I pay attention, she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment, not with the complexity he sometimes directed at her in unguarded moments, but with something clearer and more fundamental than that. The look of a man who has been running very hard for a very long time on his own, and has just had the specific experience of not being alone in a problem. I'll ride to the Carlson Ranch this morning, he said. They'll have surplus feed this time of year. The Patterson place too, if the Carlsons are short, Abigail said. And I'm sorry, I know it's not my business, but if Mr. Whitmore hears about the fire before you've secured the feed, he'll adjust his offer. You might want to move quickly. Luke looked at her sharply. You think he'd use it? I think men who make offers with conditions have a way of adjusting those conditions when circumstances change, she said. But I don't know him. You do. He stood up. He was already thinking through what came next. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. He picked up his hat, stopped at the door. Abigail, he said. She looked up. What you did this morning, laying it out like that. He stopped, found whatever he was looking for. Thank you. He went out into the cold morning. Abigail stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, hearing her name in his voice. Not Miss Carter, not said, with the careful formality of the first weeks, and she felt the shift in the boundary. She'd noted the night before, move another increment in a direction that was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly inconvenient. She turned to the stove and began breakfast. Jesse came in first, as always, stamping snow from his boots, and stopped when he smelled what was cooking. Is that flapjacks, Abigail said. Sit down, Jesse. You've had a hard morning. Jesse sat down and put his elbows on the table and looked at her with the uncomplicated, unguarded affection of someone who has been fed well and kindly for long enough that the gratitude has become something larger than its origins. Miss Abigail, he said, I want you to know something. What's that? When they told us there was going to be a new cook, he said, I thought, well, another one. And she'll probably last 2 weeks, and then we'll be back to Colton burning everything. He paused. I'm real glad you didn't last 2 weeks. Abigail smiled. So am I, she said. She set a plate of flapjacks in front of him. He ate 3 before anyone else arrived. Outside. Luke Walker rode hard toward the Carlson Ranch in the cold morning light, and Harold Whitmore sat in his office in Millhaven, not yet knowing about the fire, and Victoria Whitmore's carriage was somewhere on the road back to town, and the hay barn's east end still smelled of smoke in the cold air, and none of these things had resolved themselves yet into the shape they were going to take. But the kitchen was warm, and the flapjacks were hot, and Jesse was on his 4th one, and somewhere in the middle of what was difficult and unresolved and uncertain. Red Creek Ranch was still standing still, working, still fed. And that Abigail Carter had learned from her mother a long time ago is sometimes the most important thing. It was in early December when the letter arrived. Luke brought it in from town himself, which was unusual. He generally sent Jesse for the mail, and he set it on the kitchen table without a word, and stood there with a quality in his posture that made Abigail look up from the bread she was kneading. The letter was from a law firm in Denver. Luke had not opened it yet. It came to the ranch directly, he said, not to my postbox in town. Abigail looked at the envelope, at the name printed in the return address corner, at the way Luke was standing. Do you know what it is? She asked. I have a guess, he said. He opened it. He read it. He set it on the table. Abigail waited. Whitmore, he said. He's called in the note on the northern grazing land, full amount, due in 60 days. He looked up. His face was entirely controlled, the way his face was entirely controlled, when the thing happening was serious enough that he could not afford to let it move him. If I can't pay, he gets the land. 2,000 acres. And with the land goes the access to the creek, which means the remaining herd has no reliable water source in dry season. Abigail looked at him. He did this after you refused his offer. He did this 4 days after I told him I needed more time to consider it, Luke said, which apparently to Harold Whitmore means the same as refusing. The kitchen was very quiet. 60 days, Abigail said. 60 days. She turned back to her bread and pressed her hands into the dough and thought. Luke sat down at the table and picked up the letter and read it again, as people do when they hope the second reading will change what the first reading said. It didn't. "There's a cattle auction in Pueblo in February," Abigail said. "If you brought your best 20 head to market before Whitmore's deadline—" "I know about the auction," Luke said. "I've been planning for it. But 20 head at February prices won't cover $2,000, not even close." "What about the timber on the eastern ridge? Colton mentioned it once, that it had never been logged." Luke looked at her. "How do you know the timber's worth anything?" "I don't," she said. "But I know you haven't explored it as an asset, and this seems like the moment to explore everything." Howe was quiet. He was looking at her with that look again, the clear, fundamental one, the one that had no complexity in it, except the complexity of a man understanding something new about his situation. "You think like a rancher," he said. "I think like someone who's run out of resources before," Abigail said. "When you've been there, you learn to see every option, including the ones you haven't needed yet." Luke sat with that for a moment. Then he stood, picked up the letter, folded it carefully. "I'm going to ride the eastern ridge tomorrow morning," he said. "Assess the timber myself." "I'll have breakfast ready early," Abigail said. He stopped at the kitchen door. He turned back and looked at her standing at the work table with flour on her hands and the bread dough in front of her, entirely ordinary, entirely unremarkable, in the way that only things of genuine importance manage to be. "Abigail," he said, and then stopped as though the sentence he'd started didn't have an ending he was ready to reach. She waited. "Nothing," he said. "Early breakfast, thank you." He went. She pressed her hands back into the dough and kept her eyes on her work, and told herself very firmly that his unfinished sentence meant exactly nothing. That men stop mid-thought all the time, that she was a cook in his kitchen, and nothing that was happening was anything more than two people in difficult circumstances being useful to each other. She told herself this with great conviction. She believed almost none of it. Luke rode the eastern ridge for 4 hours and came back with mud on his boots and something different in his eyes. Abigail was at the stove when he came in, and she knew from the way he moved through the door, not the heavy, deliberate movement of a man carrying bad news, but something quicker with a forward lean to it, that whatever he had found on that ridge was not nothing. He poured himself coffee without sitting down. "Timber's there," he said. "Good timber. Douglas fir mostly, some ponderosa. The stand on the north face is dense enough that a logging operation could pull significant board feet without clearing anything that would damage the grazing land below." "How significant?" Abigail asked. "Enough," he said. "Possibly enough." He drank his coffee, set the cup down, picked it up again. He was thinking fast. She could see it, the particular velocity of a man who has been sitting with a problem so long that finding a door in it produces almost physical momentum. "I'd need to bring a timber assessor out before I could put a real number to it. But it's there. It's real." "Who would you use for the assessment?" "Man named Greer out of Colorado Springs. He's reputable. He won't pad the numbers to make a deal look better than it is." "How soon can he come?" "I'll send a wire today." Luke set his coffee down again and finally looked at her directly. "If Greer confirms what I think is there, I can negotiate a timber contract and use the advance against Whitmore's note. It won't cover everything, but it buys time. Real time, not borrowed favor time." "Then send the wire," Abigail said. "I intend to." He stopped. He was looking at her with a slight furrow in his brow, not displeasure, the look of someone working out something that doesn't fit neatly into any existing category. "How did you know about the ridge?" "Colton mentioned it once," she said, "in passing. He said the eastern timber was the one thing the ranch hadn't touched. I filed it away." "You file a lot of things away," he said. "It's useful," she said. "Would you like breakfast before you go to town?" "I already?" He stopped, looked at the stove. "What is that?" "Corn porridge, and there's bacon left." He sat down. She put a plate in front of him and went back to her own work, and for a few minutes the kitchen had the quiet of a room where two people are comfortable enough with each other that silence doesn't require filling. Then Luke said, without looking up from his plate, "I want to say something." Abigail waited. "When I hired you," he said. "I thought I was hiring a cook." He paused. "I want you to know that I'm aware it's been more than that." Abigail kept her hands moving. "I've just done what was needed. That's more than most people manage," he said. He finished his plate. He stood and picked up his hat and coat. At the door he paused, as he had been doing with increasing frequency, that pause that meant something he hadn't finished saying. "I'll be back by afternoon. Greer can be here by end of next week if the weather holds." He left. Abigail stood still in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. Then Jessie came in looking for coffee and found her standing with a dishcloth in her hand and nothing in particular on her face. And Jessie, who was perceptive in the way that young people sometimes are when they're not trying to be looked at her, and then at the door, and then back at her, and said nothing at all, which was the most tactful thing he had done in 2 months. He just poured his own coffee. "Thank you, Jessie," Abigail said. "Didn't do anything," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway." Greer arrived on a Thursday a week, and 2 days later, in the middle of what had become the coldest stretch of the December so far. He was a compact, businesslike man who spoke in numbers and fractions and showed no interest in anything that was not timber-related, which Abigail respected. He spent 2 full days on the eastern ridge with a surveying kit and a notebook, and came back to the ranch each evening to eat at the kitchen table, where he produced no social conversation whatsoever, but did eat 3 servings of stew on the first night and 4 biscuits on the second morning, which Abigail counted as approval. On the third morning, he put his assessment on Luke's desk. Abigail was not in the room, but she was in the kitchen with the door open, and she heard Luke read through it, heard the silence in which he read it, heard him exhale slowly. Not relief, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The sound a man makes when the number is real. Luke came into the kitchen. He put the assessment on the table. He didn't speak immediately. He sat down. He put both hands flat on the table, a thing he did when he was anchoring himself in something. "It's enough," he said, "for the note and a reserve. If I negotiate the contract before the end of the month." Abigail looked at him. "Then you can tell Whitmore no." "Then I can tell Whitmore no," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. "Congratulations," Abigail said quietly. Luke looked at the assessment on the table. Then he said something he clearly hadn't planned to say because it came out with the unpracticed quality of a thought that bypassed the usual editing. "I want you to be at the meeting when I tell him. I know it's an unusual request, but I want—" He stopped. "The way you read situations. I'd rather have you in the room than not." Abigail went still. "You don't have to," he said quickly. "It's an odd thing to ask." "It's not odd," she said. "When is he coming?" "I'm going to ride to Millhaven tomorrow morning and make the appointment myself. I'm not doing this by letter." "Good," she said. "Don't do it by letter." He almost smiled. "No," he agreed. "I won't." Harold Whitmore arrived at Red Creek Ranch on a Saturday afternoon in the 3rd week of December, and he arrived with his daughter. Victoria had not been announced. She stepped down from the carriage after her father, with the composed expression of someone who has thought through the social dynamics of the room she is about to enter and has decided how she intends to navigate them. When she saw Abigail in the front hallway, Luke had asked her to be present, and Abigail had dressed for it in her better dress, her hair arranged properly. Victoria's expression did something that was not surprise, but was adjacent to it. A flicker of something private. Then it was gone, and she was composed again, extending her hand to Abigail with genuine warmth. "Miss Carter," she said, "it's good to see you again." "Miss Whitmore," Abigail said, "welcome back to Red Creek Ranch." Harold Whitmore barely glanced at Abigail. She was furniture again. She noticed it and filed it away. They went into the front room. Luke's office, really, though. He'd cleared the papers from the desk and arranged the chairs with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that the physical organization of a room communicates something before anyone speaks. He sat behind the desk. Whitmore sat opposite him. Victoria sat to the side, slightly removed, with the quality of someone who is observing rather than participating. Abigail stood near the door. Whitmore opened with pleasantries that were not pleasantries. The smooth, practiced preamble of a man who uses social warmth as a displacement strategy. He remarked on the cold on the drive from Millhaven on the state of the roads. He asked after the herd. He noted the hay barn fire with the particular sympathy of a man who has already calculated what the hay barn fire is worth to him. Luke let him finish. Then he put Greer's timber assessment on the desk, turned it around so the numbers faced Whitmore, and slid it across. Whitmore picked it up, read it. His face did not change, which told Abigail more than any visible reaction would have. A man whose face doesn't change when the number surprises him is a man who has had long practice at not being surprised in rooms where other people are watching. Interesting, Whitmore said. A timber operation would take time to establish, of course. The revenue isn't immediate. The advance on the contract is, Luke said. I've already spoken with 2 logging operations out of Colorado Springs. They're both interested. The advance from either one covers the full amount of the note on the northern grazing land, with enough left over to carry the herd through spring. Silence. I see, Whitmore said. I wanted to meet in person, Luke said, because I wanted to be clear, and I didn't want there to be any misunderstanding about what I'm saying. The note will be paid in full by the end of the month. I thank you for the terms you've extended over the past 2 years, but I won't be pursuing any additional arrangement with your bank. Whitmore set the assessment down on the desk with a precision that was itself a response. Careful contained the deliberateness of a man choosing not to say the first thing that came to him. That's your prerogative, he said. Of course. It is, Luke said. A pause. Then Whitmore said, You understand that rejecting this arrangement closes certain doors. I understand, Luke said. I've thought about it. The Millhaven Bank is the primary financial institution for ranches in this territory. The smooth voice had acquired an edge. Just barely. Just enough. Future credit needs. I'll cross those roads when I come to them, Luke said. Whitmore picked up his hat. He stood. He looked at Luke for a moment, with the particular expression of a man recalibrating, not angry, not yet, but noting this moment as one that will matter to him later, filing it away in a particular way. Then he looked at Abigail. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her before, not as furniture, but as a person, which meant as a factor. His gaze moved between her and Luke once briefly, and something settled into his face. I see, he said again. He said it differently this time. Victoria stood. She looked at her father, then at Luke, then at Abigail. Her expression was composed and entirely private. Thank you for receiving us, Mr. Walker, Victoria said. The ranch is looking well. Thank you for coming, Luke said. They left. Luke stood at the window and watched the carriage go through the gate. Abigail stood beside him, not touching, not speaking. They watched in silence. He'll make trouble, Abigail said. Yes, Luke said. How much trouble can he make? Enough. He turned from the window. He supplies credit to half the ranches in the territory. If he tells them not to do business with me. He stopped. Feed suppliers, equipment dealers, neighbors who need to trust that I'm a sound investment before they'll partner with me on anything. He'd do that, Abigail said. Harold Whitmore, Luke said, has been moving money and people in this territory for 30 years. He doesn't lose gracefully. He looked at her. I knew that going in. Then why? Because the alternative was worse, he said. He said it simply without drama, the way he said things that he'd thought through completely, and arrived at a conclusion that could bear weight. The alternative was spending the rest of my life on a ranch I'd essentially sold for the price of a debt. That's not a ranch. That's a sentence. Abigail looked at him. No, she said. It's not. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly, Thank you for being in that room. I didn't say anything, she said. I know, he said. Thank you for that too. The trouble began before Christmas. It started small. The way trouble often starts, the kind of small that you could dismiss if you were inclined to dismiss things, except that Abigail had been raised by a woman who said that the first small sign of a thing is always worth more attention than the thing itself. So she paid attention. The grain supplier in Millhaven sent word that their usual arrangement was no longer available. Cash only going forward, which was a polite way of saying that someone had spoken to them. The equipment dealer sent a similar message regarding a replacement part Luke had ordered for the hay press. A neighboring ranch that had always been reliably cordial sent a note declining to partner on a spring cattle drive they'd informally agreed to months earlier. Each thing taken alone could have a reason. Together they formed a picture. Luke saw it. He said nothing to the men, but Abigail could see it in the way he carried himself through those December days. The particular kind of control that a man employs when he's managing something privately, so as not to spread the weight of it to others. She did not approach him about it directly. It was not her place, and she knew it, but she also knew that her not approaching it directly did not mean she was not thinking about it, constantly, running calculations in the back of her mind, the way she ran kitchen calculations, looking for the number that made the equation work. On Christmas Eve, she baked everything she knew how to bake. It was an extravagance. She knew it was. But she had worked out the pantry math, and there was room for it. And she had a feeling, the particular intuition of a woman who has been paying close attention for 2 months, that the men needed it more than the pantry needed the reserves. She started at 3 in the morning. By 6, she had 2 apple pies, a molasses cake, corn dodgers with preserves, enough biscuits to last through the following day, a pot of bean soup with the last of the dried pork, and a sweet potato pie for Davis, with the nutmeg and orange peel, which she had started making regularly, because Davis had not said anything about it, and she had learned that Davis's silences meant something different from other men's silences. Jesse was the first one in. He stopped in the doorway and stared. "Miss Abigail," he said. "Merry Christmas, Jesse," she said. He looked at all of it. The pies cooling on the rack, the biscuits in the cloth-lined basket, the cake on its plate, the table set with actual candles she had found in the back of the pantry and trimmed and set in empty jar lids because there were no proper candlesticks. He looked at all of it, and his face did the young person thing. It did. Sometimes the thing that reminded her that he was 19 and had been away from home since he was 17, and that some distances are harder than others at certain times of year. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "Sit down," she said gently. He sat down and put his hands around his coffee cup and said nothing for a moment, and she left him to it. The other men came in one by one, and each one of them had the same moment, the stopping, the registering, the quiet shift in the face that told Abigail that she had guessed correctly about what was needed. Colton stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the table for a long moment with his hat in his hand. "My mother used to do this," he said. He didn't elaborate. He sat down. Hector, the oldest hand, looked at the candles in the jar lids. He reached out and straightened one that was slightly crooked. Then he sat down and helped himself to 3 biscuits and said nothing, but the straightening of the candle said what he meant. Davis came in last. He saw the sweet potato pie on the rack. He looked at Abigail. "Merry Christmas, Davis," she said. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then he said, "My grandmother used to say that a person who cooks with care is speaking a language God understands." The kitchen was very quiet. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Abigail said. "She was," Davis said. He sat down. Luke came in 10 minutes after the men, which was later than usual. He stood in the kitchen door and looked at the room. The candles, the table, the men eating with a kind of ease that hadn't been there in weeks. And then he looked at Abigail with an expression that was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Raw, almost. Like something had come up through the careful, managed exterior and arrived on his face without his full permission. He looked at her for a moment. Just that. Then he said, "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," she said. "Sit down. Everything's warm." He sat down. He ate. He did not stand in the doorway this time. After breakfast, as the men dispersed to their morning tasks, Luke remained at the table with his coffee. Abigail cleaned up around him, and after a while he said, "Whitmore's been talking to people." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "How long have you known?" "Since the grain supplier sent that letter." "You didn't say anything." "You knew," she said. "I didn't think you needed me to list it for you." He was quiet. "The Hanson brothers aren't going to take our cattle at market in February. I heard this morning." The Hanson brothers were the largest cattle brokers operating between Pueblo and Denver. Their refusal meant Luke would have to sell at smaller markets at lower prices, with fewer buyers competing for the animals. "How much does that change the February revenue?" she asked. "Cuts it by roughly a third," he said. "Which means the timber advance works for the note, but the cash reserve for the rest of winter is thin. Thinner than I want it." He turned his coffee cup. "If anything else goes wrong between now and spring." "What else could go wrong?" she said, not dismissing it. Asking directly the way he had learned she asked when she needed real information rather than reassurance. "Weather mainly. If we lose more feed if there's a long cold snap that taxes the herd." He stopped. "The creek's been running low already, if it freezes solid before March." "The creek," Abigail said. She had stopped moving. Something was working in her mind, a connection that was forming from pieces she'd been holding separately. "The northern grazing land controls the creek access." "Yes," he said slowly, watching her. "And Whitmore called in that note specifically after you refused the marriage arrangement." "Yes." "So the original intent was," she stopped, "was to get the grazing land," Luke said, "which gives him the creek access, which gives him effectively a water right that affects not just my ranch, but 3 neighboring ranches that also graze along that section." He looked at her. "I figured that out in September. That's why the marriage offer made sense to him. It would have been more elegant than calling in the note. Either way, he gets what he actually wants." Abigail stared at him. "You knew this in September." "Yes. And you still refused him." "Yes. Even knowing what he might do." "Abigail." He said her name with a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not distance, not formality, but something direct and undefended. "I built this ranch with my hands and my father's before that. I'm not going to hand it over to Harold Whitmore because he's positioned his pieces better than I have. I'd rather lose it fighting than keep it surrendering." The kitchen was quiet. "Then we need to find another way to get water to the herd if the creek situation worsens," she said. He blinked. "We," he said. She looked at him. The word had come out without her noticing, and she noticed it now, and she did not take it back. "Yes," she said. "We." Luke looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, that long, slow shift she had been watching for weeks. The one that moved like seasons move, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small changes that you only see when you compare what it looked like at the beginning to what it looks like now. He said nothing. He picked up his coffee. He did not disagree. The new year came in cold and relentless, and with it came the thing that none of them had fully prepared for. The creek did not freeze. What happened was worse. In the first week of January, after 3 days of hard rain, followed by a sudden freeze, the wooden bridge that connected the southern pasture to the main access road washed out. Not partially, entirely. 50 feet of bridge timber gone downstream in a single overnight surge of water. And in the morning, where there had been a bridge, there was broken ice and fast water and a 12-foot gap that no cattle could cross. Luke stood at the bank and looked at it. Colton stood beside him. "We can rebuild," Colton said. "How long?" 2 weeks minimum. More like 3. We don't have the lumber on hand. We'd have to order it. "And the cattle drive to market is in how many days?" 18. They were both quiet. The cattle market in Pueblo was the fallback after the Hanson brothers had pulled out. If they missed it, the next viable market was April. 3 months away. 3 months with a full herd eating through feed reserves that were already running thin from the hay barn fire. "Is there another way to move the cattle?" Luke said. "Not that I know of," Colton said. That was when Abigail arrived. She had come down from the house when Jesse told her about the bridge. She stood at the bank and looked at the water and the broken ice and the gap, and she was thinking the look she had when she was running calculations present, but somewhere behind her eyes working through something. "There's another route," she said. Both men looked at her. "My father used an old wagon trail in the eastern foothills," she said. "When I was young, it connected to the Pueblo Road about 8 miles south of the main junction. It bypassed the creek entirely." She looked at Luke. "He used it during the flood year when every bridge in the county was out. I was 7, but I remember it." You remember a trail from when you were 7, Colton said. Not unkindly, just clearly. I remember everything my father showed me, she said. Because he said a woman who knows the land knows her own survival. He made me learn it. Luke looked at her, then at the gap in the bridge, then back at her. How rough is the trail? Rough, she said honestly. It's been years. But my father said the ground there was solid limestone shelf under the topsoil. It wouldn't wash out the way river bottom land does. You're talking about moving 140 cattle through foothill terrain in January, Colton said. I'm talking about moving 140 cattle to market before we miss the window, Abigail said. The terrain is the obstacle. Missing the market is the catastrophe. Silence. Luke looked at her. You'd need to ride with us, he said, to find the trail. I know, she said. He held her gaze. There was something in his eyes that she felt in the center of her chest. Not sentiment, not in that moment, but the specific recognition of one person seeing another person clearly, all the way through without reservation. You sure, he said. I'm sure, she said. Get me a horse I can trust and I'll find the trail. Colton looked at Luke. Luke looked at Colton. Something passed between them, and then Colton turned and walked toward the barn with the purposeful step of a man who has accepted a decision and is already implementing it. Luke looked back at Abigail. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I hired you, he said, I told Colton you'd probably last 2 weeks. He paused. I want you to know that I was wrong. And I want you to know that being wrong has never made me less certain of anything I've believed since. Abigail held that for a moment. Which things? She said carefully. He opened his mouth. Stopped. The careful man reasserting himself, the man who had learned that saying things made them real in ways that couldn't be managed. We should get ready to move the herd, he said. She looked at him. Luke. He looked back at her. After the cattle are in Pueblo, she said, and the market is done, and the bills are paid, we should finish that conversation. His jaw did the thing it did. The containment thing. But underneath it, something she had not seen there before, a kind of terrified, careful, absolute wanting. Yes, he said. We should. They moved the herd 3 days later. Abigail rode at the front beside Luke, and she found the trail the way her father had taught her, not by landmark, but by feel, by the quality of the ground under the horse's hooves, by the way. The limestone shelf held firm under the thin snow, while the surrounding soil would not have. She called the turns from memory and instinct, and every turn she called was right, and the men followed without question, because the turns were right and they all knew it. They drove the cattle through 8 miles of foothill terrain in January cold, and every man on that drive understood that they were doing it because of a woman who had walked 8 miles to a job interview carrying a pie tin and had never once suggested that was anything other than ordinary. The cattle arrived in Pueblo 18 hours later. They sold well. Better than projected, because 2 other herds had failed to make the market due to the same flood conditions that had taken out the bridge, and fewer cattle meant better prices. And by the time the last animal was tallied and the papers signed, Luke Walker had enough to pay Whitmore's note in full, maintain his reserve through spring, and have something left over that constituted not comfort, but breathing room. He stood outside the auction house in the cold Pueblo evening and looked at the papers in his hand. Abigail stood beside him. You found the trail, he said. My father found the trail, she said. I just remembered it. That's the same thing, he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the papers, but not really. His eyes were somewhere beyond them. Say it, she said quietly. He looked at her. Whatever you've been working up to for 3 months, she said. We're not at the ranch. There's no ledger to look at and no fire to tend. Say it. Luke Walker, who had managed 36 years without saying the thing when it needed saying, who had built a wall around caring so comprehensive that even he had occasionally forgotten what was behind it, looked at Abigail Carter in the cold Pueblo evening and said, I don't wait in the kitchen doorway on Sunday evenings because of the pie. She looked at him. I think, he said, you already knew that. I did, she said. I needed you to know it too. He exhaled. Something in his shoulders released that had been held for months, maybe years. The specific tension of a man who has been carrying the weight of something he refused to name. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm likely to be—" "Luke," she said. "What?" "I walked 8 miles carrying a pie," she said. "I'm not afraid of difficult." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had come to Red Creek Ranch, he smiled fully without the careful management that usually contained it, without the half gesture that stood in for the real thing, and it changed his face entirely the way a room changes when someone finally opens a window. "No," he said. "I reckon you're not." Behind them, the auction house lights came on against the darkening sky, and somewhere in the pens, the last of the Red Creek cattle made the sounds of animals that have arrived somewhere safe, and the Pueblo evening was cold and clear, and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had shifted permanently between two people standing in the street with papers in their hands, and everything still undecided, and the best parts still ahead. They rode back from Pueblo in 2 days, and the ride back was different from every ride that had come before it. Not because anything had been declared. Not because Luke had reached for her hand or said anything further beyond what he'd said outside the auction house. He was not a man who, having opened a door, immediately walked through it and started rearranging the furniture. He was a man who opened a door and then stood in it for a while, making sure the floor on the other side was solid before he committed his weight to it. Abigail understood this. She was not a woman who needed the whole thing at once, but the ride back was different because of the way he rode beside her rather than ahead. Luke rode ahead of people as a matter of habit and disposition. He was the one who knew where they were going. He set the pace. He made the calls. On the ride home from Pueblo, he stayed level with her, matching his horse's pace to hers on the foothill trail without making anything of it, without explaining it. He just did it. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She filed it away in the same place she kept everything that mattered. The men noticed too, or at least Colton did, because Colton noticed most things that were worth noticing and a fair number of things that weren't. He said nothing to Abigail about it directly. But when they arrived back at Red Creek Ranch and the men were seeing to the horses, he found a moment beside her in the barn and said quietly, looking at the horse he was unsaddling rather than at her, "You know what you're getting into with a man like him." "Tell me," she said. "He cares hard, and he shows it slow," Colton said. "He'll take twice as long to say the thing as any ordinary man, and half the time he'll try to show it with a fence repair or a supply run instead of words, because words cost him something and lumber doesn't." He paused. "And when he's decided something, he's decided it. There's no halfway with Luke Walker." "I know," she said. Colton looked at her then. "Good," he said. He picked up the saddle and walked away. Jesse characteristically handled it with less subtlety. He caught Abigail in the kitchen the morning after their return and said with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to frame things diplomatically, "Is Luke courting you?" "Jesse," Abigail said. "Because if he is, that's real good. And if he isn't, somebody ought to tell him he should be, and I'm willing to do that." "Do not tell him anything," Abigail said firmly. "So he is." "Jesse, I won't say a word," he said. He mimed, sealing his mouth. "Not one word." He poured his coffee, took 3 steps toward the door, and turned back. "For what it's worth, and I know you didn't ask, every man on this ranch would rather you stayed than any other thing that could happen to this place, including the timber deal." He went out. Abigail stood at the stove and felt something that was too full for a single name: gratitude and tenderness, and the particular warmth of being wanted in a place genuinely wanted by people who had no obligation to want her there. She turned back to her biscuits. She was still smiling when Luke came in for breakfast. He looked at her. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Sit down. Coffee's hot." He sat. He watched her for a moment with that look he'd been developing since Pueblo, less guarded, the careful management, slightly relaxed, like a man who has put down something heavy and is still getting used to the absence of the weight. "I need to go into Mill Haven today," he said. She looked up. "To pay the note." "To pay the note?" he confirmed. "In person, full amount." I want to hand Harold Whitmore a bank draft and watch him accept it. Take Jesse with you, she said. Not Colton. Jesse. He'll keep his face right and he won't say anything inflammatory. Luke looked at her. You think I might say something inflammatory? I think Harold Whitmore is going to make it difficult to stay quiet, she said. And I think having a young man beside you who looks up to you is better incentive to stay composed than having Colton, who will absolutely not stay composed. The corner of Luke's mouth moved. When did you become the one managing my decisions? I've always managed things, she said pleasantly. You just noticed it. He almost laughed. Actually, almost. The sound didn't quite make it all the way out, but it was close, closer than she'd heard before, and she counted it as a significant development. He took Jesse to Millhaven. They were gone most of the day. Abigail spent the hours in motion. Bread, a pot of beans for the week, a thorough cleaning of the wood stove that it had needed for 2 weeks, a careful accounting of the pantry to see how far the winter reserves would carry, now that the market proceeds had stabilized the supply situation. She worked, and she did not think too hard about what was happening in Millhaven, because thinking too hard about things she could not affect was a habit she had trained out of herself in the months after her father died. What she could not avoid thinking about, because it forced its way through her practical focus every time she paused, was what Colton had said. He'll take twice as long to say the thing as any ordinary man. She was patient. She had demonstrated patience at a level most people never got to test. But she was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that patience is easier to maintain when the thing you're waiting for feels possible. Standing in the Pueblo evening with Luke Walker, smiling at her, really smiling, had made it feel more than possible. It had made it feel like a thing that already existed somewhere and was only waiting on time to arrive. Luke and Jesse got back before supper. Jesse came in first, and the look on his face careful, slightly flushed. Working hard to contain something told Abigail that whatever had happened in Millhaven was more than a simple bank transaction. How did it go? She asked. Jesse opened his mouth, looked at the door, looked back at her. Luke should tell you, he said with the admirable discipline of someone actively fighting their instinct to tell it themselves. Luke came in 30 seconds later. He stood in the kitchen door. He looked at Abigail. He had the quality of a man who has ridden hard and is still processing. He didn't take the draft, Luke said. Abigail went still. What do you mean he didn't take it? He refused it. Luke came fully inside, put his hat on the peg, stood at the counter. He said the note was non-negotiable, and he was proceeding with the claim on the northern grazing land, regardless of the payment. He can't do that, she said. If the note is paid in full, he says there's a provision in the original agreement. Luke pulled a folded paper from his coat. A clause about payment timing. He's claiming that because I didn't pay within a specific window, defined by the original creditor's schedule, not the 60-day demand he sent, but the original signing schedule. I've technically defaulted, and the payment window has passed. He set the paper on the table. Abigail looked at it. Is that enforceable? I don't know, he said. I need a lawyer. Is there a lawyer in Millhaven? There's one. Name's Hennessy. I went to see him after the bank. And? Luke looked at her. He's Harold Whitmore's personal attorney. The kitchen was very quiet. Jesse, to his credit, had the sense to be silent. He stood near the door with his hat in his hands, looking like a young man who is watching something important happen, and is appropriately humbled by proximity to it. Abigail picked up the paper. She read it. She was not a lawyer, and she had no formal training in contracts, but she had learned to read everything carefully. Her father had insisted on it, had sat beside her at the farm table when she was 12 years old, going through the bank's land documents, word by word, saying never sign anything you haven't read and never read anything you don't intend to understand. She read it slowly. She read it twice. There's a date error, she said. Luke looked at her sharply. What? The original note was signed in March of 1880, she said. This clause references a payment schedule beginning in April of 1880, but it specifies the first payment was due 30 days from signing. She looked up. 30 days from March is April. But this clause says the window opened on March 1st before the note was even signed. Luke crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and looked at the paper over her shoulder. Right there, she said, pointing. The clause refers to March 1st as the schedule anchor date. The note was signed March 19th. The clause as written references a date that precedes the contract's existence. Silence. That's a drafting error, Luke said slowly. Or it's intentional, Abigail said. Written vaguely enough to be usable when he needed it, but with enough internal inconsistency to collapse under real scrutiny. Which means you need a lawyer who isn't Harold Whitmore's, she said. And you need one quickly. Is there anyone in Pueblo, Colorado Springs? Colorado Springs, he said immediately. Man named Aldrich. He handled the timber contract review. He's sharp, and he doesn't owe Whitmore anything. Then send a wire tonight, she said. Luke looked at her. Tonight, she said. Whitmore is going to move fast now that you've tried to pay the note. He knows you have the money. He'll file whatever he needs to file before you can counter it. The date error is real, but it only matters if there's someone to argue it in front of a judge before the filing goes through. Luke stared at her for a moment. Then he turned to Jesse. Get the horses back out, he said. We're going to the telegraph office. Jesse was out the door before the sentence finished. Luke turned back to Abigail. He looked at her with that look, the clear one, the fundamental one, and said, You just go, she said. I'll keep supper warm. He went. Aldrich's reply came the following morning. He had seen the clause before, not the exact one, but the type. He said it was a common Whitmore tactic inserting vague timing provisions that could be weaponized selectively, and that the date discrepancy Abigail had identified was in his professional judgment, fatal to Whitmore's position if it could be argued before the right judge. He would be in Millhaven within 4 days. Luke read the wire at the breakfast table and set it down in the middle of his eggs. The men were all present. He read it aloud, which was not something he typically did. Luke kept ranch business at the management level and didn't broadcast it to the hands unless action was required of them. But he read it aloud that morning, and Abigail understood that he was doing it because the men deserved to know that the fight was still being fought and that the terms had shifted. When he finished reading, the table was quiet for a moment. Then Davis said, Good. That was all. Just good. In Davis's particular economy of language, it carried the full weight of everything a longer response would have said. Colton looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. He gave a single nod, small, definite, the nod of a man acknowledging that a thing has been done correctly. Jesse naturally could not leave it at a nod. Miss Abigail found the error, he said to the table with the enthusiasm of a man reporting something that absolutely needs to be on record. In the clause, she's the one who caught it. Jesse, Abigail said. It's true, he said. It's also not relevant who found it, she said. What's relevant is that Mr. Aldrich is coming and the argument is sound. Luke looked at her from the head of the table. His face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing she had learned to read in increments, the accumulation of small expressions that together formed something larger than any single one of them. It's relevant, he said quietly. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and said nothing, and the table moved on, and under the table, where no one could see it, she pressed her hand flat against her knee to hold the feeling steady. The 4 days before Aldrich arrived were not quiet days. The trouble, Abigail had predicted, the slow, methodical trouble that Whitmore set in motion when he lost gracefully, was not available to him as an option, arrived in a different form than she had expected. Not suppliers this time, not business partners, people. It started with Mrs. Caldwell, the wife of a neighboring rancher, who encountered Colton at the feed store in Crestwood, and said in the particular tone of a woman who has information she considers important and a social obligation to share it. I heard there's a young woman living at Red Creek Ranch, unmarried, living in the house. Colton, who had the social grace of a fence post in most situations, managed to say only that Miss Carter was the ranch cook and lived in the kitchen quarters, which was true, and left before the conversation could develop further. He told Abigail that evening. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, How many people did Mrs. Caldwell tell before she told you? Colton's expression confirmed that Mrs. Caldwell had been busy. The talk moved fast in small territories. By the end of the week, the version circulating through the ranching community of the region had evolved considerably from its origin. The quiet, competent cook, who had reorganized a struggling kitchen, had become in the retelling something more dramatic and considerably less respectable. A young woman of unknown background, installed at Red Creek Ranch, suspiciously close to the owner. Possibly the reason Luke Walker had refused the Whitmore arrangement. Luke heard it from the Carlson Ranch's foreman, who told him directly and without embellishment, because he was that kind of man. "I thought you should know what's being said," the foreman said. "I don't believe it, but not everyone's in the position of knowing you personally, and Whitmore's name is behind a lot of the credit in this valley." Luke came home from that conversation and went directly to his office and closed the door. He came out an hour later and found Abigail in the kitchen. "You know," he said. "Colton told me," she said. "It's Whitmore," he said. "Not Mrs. Caldwell, she's just his instrument. He's using it because the legal strategy isn't moving fast enough for him." "I know," she said. Luke stood in the kitchen and looked at her with an expression that had something painful in it. "I'm sorry," he said. "This is because of me. Because I refused him." "It's because of him," Abigail said. "Don't take credit for Harold Whitmore's behavior." "Abigail." "Luke." She set down what she was holding. She turned and looked at him fully. "I am a woman who buried her parents, lost her home, walked 8 miles in October, cold to a job I wasn't sure I'd be given, and spent the winter keeping 14 people fed, and a ranch functional through a fire and a flood and a legal assault." She paused. "I am not undone by gossip." He looked at her. "What I need to know," she said more quietly, "is whether you are." The question landed. She watched it land. She watched him absorb it, and she did not look away, because the answer to this question was the actual answer to a larger question she had been holding since Pueblo, and she was not going to manage his response by softening the delivery. Luke Walker looked at her for a long, silent moment. "No," he said. "I am not." She held that. "Good," she said. "Then let Aldrich do his job, and don't let Whitmore use your conscience against you. That's what he's counting on." "My conscience," Luke said slowly. "He knows you're an honorable man," she said. "He's hoping that if he makes this cost you something reputationally, you'll offer to settle to protect other people from the fallout." She looked at him. "Don't." Luke stared at her. Then he said, "Have you always been this clear about how things work?" "My mother taught me to read situations," she said. "She said a woman who doesn't understand the room she's standing in has already lost half her ground." "Your mother," he said, "was a remarkable woman." "Yes," Abigail said. "She was." Something shifted in the room. He looked at her differently, not the complicated layered look, but something simpler and more direct than that. The look of a man who has stopped negotiating with himself about what he feels and is simply feeling it. "After this is resolved," he said, "all of it. Whitmore, the legal situation, the—" He stopped, started again. "I want to have a different conversation with you than the ones we've been having." "I know," she said. "I want to be clear about what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. "I've known for a while." He exhaled. Not the released tension this time, something else. Something that was almost like relief and almost like terror, and in the space between those two things resembled hope more than either. "Right," he said. "Right," she said. He went back to his office. Abigail turned back to her work and allowed herself exactly 1 moment. Eyes closed, hands still of something that had no practical application whatsoever, but that she had earned by every mile of the 8-mile road, by every pre-dawn morning, by every careful calculation, and every deliberate restraint. Then she opened her eyes and started on supper. Aldrich arrived on a Wednesday. How was a tall man lean through the face with the quality of someone who has spent a career in rooms full of people who were not telling the whole truth and has become exceptionally good at locating the parts they were leaving out. He shook Luke's hand and then Abigail's. She was present at Luke's specific request, positioned as the person who had found the clause error, which Aldrich immediately treated as a professional matter rather than a social curiosity. "Show me where you found it," he said. She showed him. He read it 3 times. He made a sound that was somewhere between satisfaction and contempt. "This is a Whitmore original," he said. "I've seen versions of it in 2 other cases in this territory." He used the same drafting approach in a land dispute outside Alamosa 4 years ago. The judge in that case ruled the clause unenforceable because of the internal date inconsistency. He looked at Luke. "We have precedent." "How quickly can you file?" Luke asked. "I can have the response to his claim filed in the Millhaven court by Friday morning," Aldrich said. "The judge in Millhaven is not Whitmore's judge. He came over from Denver 18 months ago, and he has no existing relationships in this territory." He paused. "That matters." "It matters a great deal," Luke said. "There's something else," Aldrich said. He set his briefcase on the table and opened it. He produced another document. "While I was preparing for this case, I had my clerk do a title search on the northern grazing land, the original deed." He set it on the table. Luke looked at it. Then he looked up at Aldrich. "What am I looking at?" "The northern grazing land was filed under your father's name in 1871, Aldrich said. "The note Whitmore holds was issued in 1880 against the land as collateral. But there's a question about whether the 1880 note was properly recorded with the Territorial Land Office. If the recording was defective, then the collateral claim itself may be invalid," Luke said slowly. "Possibly," Aldrich said. "Possibly. I need 2 more days to verify the recording. But if the recording is defective, Whitmore doesn't just lose the clause argument. He loses the note entirely." The kitchen was absolutely still. Jesse, who had come in for coffee and had frozen in the doorway at some point during this conversation, stood with his cup halfway to his mouth and did not complete the motion. Luke looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. 2 more days," Luke said to Aldrich without looking away from her. "Find out." Aldrich left to ride to the county records office. The 2 days were the longest 2 days Red Creek Ranch had experienced since the hay barn fire, and they were long in a different way. Not the physical urgency of a fire or a flood, but the drawn-out held-breath tension of a thing balanced on a point waiting to tip one way or the other. Luke worked. He always worked when he was managing something not as distraction, but as anchor the physical labor of the ranch keeping him connected to what the whole fight was for. He rode fence lines and checked on the herd and conferred with Colton about the spring planting strategy, and did all of it with the focused efficiency of a man who knows that the outcome of a thing is not always within his control, but his conduct always is. Abigail cooked. She always cooked when she was managing something too. Thursday's supper was the best meal she had made since the Christmas Eve morning. Braised venison that Hector had brought in, roasted root vegetables, fresh cornbread, and a pie. Apple. The first pie she had baked since before Pueblo, because she had been saving it, she realized for a moment that warranted it. Luke noticed. He came in Thursday evening and saw the pie on the rack and stopped. "Apple," he said. "Apple," she confirmed. He looked at her. "You're optimistic." "I'm prepared," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. Again. He was getting closer to actually doing it without a specific prompt, she noted. Progress. Friday morning Aldrich came back. He came in the front door and didn't remove his coat before he put his briefcase on the desk and opened it and found the document he wanted and set it in front of Luke without preamble. The 1880 recording was defective, he said. The Territorial Land Office has a stamped copy, but the county recorder's book shows no corresponding entry. Under territorial statute, an unrecorded lien is unenforceable against a bona fide property holder. He paused. Whitmore doesn't have a claim. He never had a claim. The note exists as a debt instrument, but he has no right to the land. Luke sat very still. He knew, Luke said. It wasn't a question. He almost certainly knew, Aldrich said. The recording defect isn't the kind of thing you miss in due diligence. It would have been discovered when he first tried to use the land as leverage, which means he's been operating on the assumption that you would never have a lawyer look at the original filing. Because most men in my situation don't, Luke said. Because most men in your situation don't, Aldrich confirmed. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Luke looked at Abigail, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had not gone further in, had not presumed to be part of this meeting until she was invited to be, because she understood the line between what was her place and what was his even now. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "Come in." She came in. "You were in that room in September when I didn't sign his offer," he said. "And you were in the room in December when I told him no. And you were in the kitchen when I came home with the letter." He stopped. "I want you in this room too." She came and stood beside him. Aldrich looked between them with the practiced neutrality of a professional who has learned that the best thing to do with other people's significant moments is to process his paperwork. "What happens now?" Abigail said. "I file the response Friday morning, which I've already done as of an hour ago," Aldrich said. "I've also sent a formal letter to Whitmore's legal counsel informing them of the recording defect. They have 30 days to respond. In my professional judgment, they will not respond because there is nothing to respond with." He closed his briefcase. "Harold Whitmore is going to have to find a different ranch to absorb." Luke exhaled. Not the releasing something exhale of a man who has set down a weight. This was different. This was the exhale of a man who has been standing braced for a blow for so long that when the blow doesn't come, the body doesn't immediately know what to do with the space where the tension used to be. He put his hand flat on the desk. He looked at the documents. "It's over," he said. "It's over," Aldrich confirmed. He shook Luke's hand. He shook Abigail's hand. "Congratulations to you both." He picked up his briefcase. "I'll see myself out." He left. The office was quiet. Abigail stood beside the desk, and Luke stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then, from the kitchen, they heard Jessie. Jessie, who had apparently been listening through the wall with absolutely no shame whatsoever, let out a sound that was somewhere between a whoop and a holler, followed immediately by Colton's voice saying, "Jessie, for the love of," and then what sounded like the scraping of chairs and boots on the kitchen floor, and the general noise of men who have received good news and are processing it at volume. Luke looked at the wall. Abigail looked at the wall. She started to laugh first quietly, genuinely, the laugh of someone who has been holding a great deal together for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. Luke looked at her, and something in her laugh did something to his face, unlocked something, and then he was laughing too. Not loud, not Jessie loud, but real. The laugh of a man who has arrived somewhere he wasn't sure he was going to reach. They stood in his office laughing about Jessie, and about Colton's resigned voice, and about everything that the sound of those boots on the kitchen floor meant. And it was the most ordinary possible response to an extraordinary thing, which was exactly right. When the laughter settled, Luke looked at her. "I believe," he said, "that I owe you a different conversation." "You do," she said. He turned to face her fully. He was not the man who had opened the door to her in October, not in any way that the surface showed, and in every way that mattered. She was not the woman who had walked 8 miles carrying a pie tin. They were still themselves, entirely themselves, but they were themselves with the weight of a winter between them. All of it, the hay fire and the frost and the bridge and the trail and the cattle market, and Whitmore and Aldrich, and the clause with the date error, and Christmas morning, and the candles in the jar lids, and the Sunday pies, and the kitchen table, and the doorway, and the unfinished sentences, all of it. "Abigail Carter," he said. He said her full name the way people say things they intend to mean completely. "I have been a solitary and difficult man for a long time, and I am aware that I have not improved notably in that regard over the course of this winter." "That's not entirely true," she said. "It is mostly true," he said. "I want you to know that I know it, and I want you to know—" He stopped. He was doing the thing again, the working to the edge of the sentence thing. But this time he kept going. "I want you to know that whatever comes next, I would rather be a solitary and difficult man in the same room as you than any other arrangement I can conceive of." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is possibly the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." "It was also," she said, "exactly right." He held her gaze. "Stay," he said, simply. One word, but with everything in it, Not just through the winter, not just for the kitchen, not just the job. All of it. The whole question in a single word. She looked at him. Outside. Jesse was still making noise. Colton was still telling him to stop. The ranch was alive with the sounds of men who had been through a hard winter together and had come out the other side. And the kitchen was warm, and the pie was cooling on the rack, and the documents on Luke Walker's desk said that Red Creek Ranch was his fully and finally and without condition. "I already am," she said. The word stayed in the room long after she said it. Stay. I already am. Luke looked at her the way a man looks at something he has wanted for long enough that the having of it requires a moment to become real. Then he nodded once, slow, definite. The nod of a man who has made a decision that he intends to honor with his whole life. And he said nothing else, because nothing else was needed, and Luke Walker had always known the difference between words that added something and words that only filled space. Jesse, however, had no such restraint. He appeared in the office doorway, approximately 45 seconds after Aldrich's boots had cleared the front porch with Colton directly behind him, wearing the expression of a man who has tried and failed to prevent an event from occurring. Jesse looked at Luke, looked at Abigail, looked at the two of them standing beside the desk with the documents between them and something new and unmistakable in the air of the room. "Well," Jesse said. "Jesse," Colton said. "I'm just saying well," Jesse said. "That's all I'm saying, well." He was grinning with the uncontained enthusiasm of someone who has been invested in an outcome for months and has just seen it confirmed. "Colton, you owe me $2. "I don't owe you anything," Colton said, but the look on his face suggested otherwise. "You said he'd need another 6 months, Jesse said. "I said by spring. It's February. That's spring adjacent." "February is not spring adjacent," Colton said. "Gentlemen," Luke said. Both men stopped. Luke looked at Jesse with the particular expression he reserved for situations that required Jesse to understand something without being humiliated by the process of understanding it. "Is there something you need from this office?" Jesse straightened. "No, sir." "Then I'll see you at supper." Jesse retreated with dignity. Colton followed him, pausing in the doorway long enough to look at Abigail with an expression that communicated in the compressed language of a man who shows things rarely that he was genuinely glad. Then he pulled the door shut behind him. Luke looked at the closed door. $2, he said. "They've been watching," Abigail said. "I know." He looked at her. "Were you watching too?" "I was standing right in the middle of it," she said. "There wasn't much watching required." He almost smiled. Full smile almost. "No," he said. "I suppose not." The afternoon light was changing in the room, moving toward the particular quality of February late afternoon. And Luke looked at the documents on his desk one more time, not reading them, just confirming they were real. The way people confirm real things, and then he covered them with a book and turned away from the desk entirely. "I'm going to need to do something," he said, "before this goes further." She looked at him. "What?" "I need to go to Millhaven," he said. "Not for Whitmore, not for the bank. I need to go to Millhaven and stand in the street and let people see me and let them draw their conclusions, and I need to do it right." He stopped. He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was his version of everything he couldn't quite put into words yet. "I'm asking if you'll come with me." Abigail held that for a moment. "You mean publicly," she said. "I mean publicly," he said. "I mean in a way that leaves no room for whatever Whitmore's been building to take hold. I mean I'm done being quiet about things that matter to me because the territory might have opinions about it." She looked at him carefully. "That's a significant change of position." "It's an overdue change of position," he said. "Will you come?" She considered him this difficult, careful, deeply stubborn man, who had taken 3 months to say things that other men said in the first week, who showed love by solving problems and riding through foothill terrain in January cold and staying level beside someone on the trail home rather than riding ahead. She considered everything he was and everything he was trying to become, and she thought about her mother, who had always said, "The measure of a man is not where he starts, it's what he's willing to walk toward." Luke Walker was walking toward something. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." They went to Millhaven on a Saturday. Saturday was the day people came into town from the ranches and farms for supplies and social calls, and the general business of community life in a small territory, which meant it was the day when being seen meant actually being seen by the people whose seeing mattered in the particular social economy of that region. Abigail wore her better dress. She had only the two, and the better one she had been careful with kept it for the Whitmore dinner for the Pueblo market, for the days when presentation was part of the work. She wore it now without deliberation, because the occasion warranted it, and she was not a woman who underdressed for things that mattered out of false modesty. Luke wore his good coat. She noticed this. He wore it without comment, the same way she wore her dress without comment, and she understood that they were both doing the same thing, arriving at the same decision, by the same logic, without having to discuss it, which was its own kind of statement about what they had become to each other over the course of a winter. They rode into Millhaven together. The first person they encountered was Mrs. Caldwell, which was not a coincidence, because Mrs. Caldwell had an instinct for positioning herself where events were likely to occur that would have made her an exceptional chess player if she had applied it to strategy rather than social surveillance. She was outside the dry goods store when Luke and Abigail rode past, and she looked at them with an expression that went through three distinct phases in rapid succession: surprised recalculation, and then something that was either acceptance or the preliminary stage of a new theory. Luke tipped his hat. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Morning." "Mr. Walker," she said. Then, after a pause that contained a great deal of processing, "Miss Carter." "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," Abigail said pleasantly. They rode on. "That'll be all over the territory by Monday," Luke said without inflection. "It was already all over the territory by Monday," Abigail said. "This time the story will be different." He looked at her. "You're very calm about this." "I told you," she said. "I'm not afraid of difficult." They did their business in Millhaven, Luke at the bank to confirm the formal resolution of the note, Abigail at the dry goods store for kitchen supplies. The dry goods store was, as she had anticipated, populated by several women she had not met, but who clearly knew who she was, and she moved through the store with the same composure she brought to everything, selecting what she needed, paying for it properly, responding to the direct looks with the direct pleasant acknowledgement of a woman who has no reason to behave as though she does. The woman behind the counter, middle-aged with the sharp eyes of someone who forms opinions quickly and holds them firmly, watched. Abigail worked through her list and then said abruptly, "You're the one who saved the Walker cattle drive." Abigail looked up. "I knew a trail," she said. "Old Patterson Trail, I heard." The woman tilted her head. "Your father showed you that." "He did." The woman was quiet for a moment. "My husband said Luke Walker's a fool for risking everything over his personal situation rather than taking the Whitmore arrangement." She paused. "I told him a man who won't sell his integrity isn't a fool. He's just inconvenient for people who expected him to be easier." She started wrapping Abigail's purchases. "You need anything else, miss?" "That's everything," Abigail said. "Thank you." She came out of the store and found Luke waiting with the horses, and he looked at her face and said, "Good or bad?" "Complicated," she said, "which is the same as good in a place like this." He helped her with the packages. His hand covered hers briefly as she passed the larger one across, and it was nothing. A functional gesture, practical, the kind of thing that happens 100 times between people who work alongside each other. But he didn't move his hand immediately, and she didn't move hers, and for a moment they just stood in the street in Millhaven on a Saturday morning, with the packages between them and people moving all around them, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely not. "Luke," said a voice. They both turned. The man walking toward them was someone Abigail had not seen before, around Luke's age, broad through the shoulders with an open face, and the particular ease of someone who has known the person they're approaching for a very long time. He was looking at Luke with a grin that was genuine and slightly incredulous. "Tom Garrett," Luke said. And then for the first time he said the thing he had not yet said in public, the thing that once said, established something in the territory's understanding of what Red Creek Ranch was and who belonged to it. "Tom, this is Abigail Carter. Abigail runs the household at Red Creek. She's been there since October." He paused for exactly half a second. She's going to be there permanently. Tom Garrett looked at Abigail with an expression of uncomplicated pleasure. Well, he said. He extended his hand. Miss Carter, I'm glad to hear it. Luke's needed someone to run that household since about 1878. 1879, Luke said. You sure? I was there, Luke said. Tom shook Abigail's hand. He looked between them with the comfortable recognition of a man who is seeing something he'd hoped to see. You should come to the Garrett's supper next month, he said. Ellen's been after me to organize one since before Christmas. Get the ranching families together before the spring work season starts. He looked at Abigail specifically. She'd want to meet you. We'd be glad to come, Abigail said. Luke looked at her. She looked back at him with the slight raise of her eyebrow that said, That's how it's done. He looked away, and the corner of his mouth moved, and Tom Garrett pretended not to notice any of it, with the social grace of a man who has been married long enough to recognize the particular language of two people who have understood each other without yet saying so to the world. They rode home in the afternoon light, and the ride home was different again from every other ride. Easier, something resolved in the air between them. The specific ease of people who have come through something together and are on the other side of it. A week later on a Sunday, Luke came into the kitchen while Abigail was baking. This was not unusual. He had been coming into the kitchen while she was baking for months. But he came in and sat at the table and did not open his ledger, which was unusual, and he sat there for a moment with his hands on the table, and then he said, I'd like to ask you something. She kept her hands in the dough. Ask, she said. I've been thinking about how to say this correctly, he said. I've been thinking about it for about 3 weeks. I want you to know that in advance, so you understand it isn't impulsive. 3 weeks, she said. Since Pueblo. Since Pueblo, he confirmed. She kept her hands moving, but she was listening with everything she had. I'm not a man who has a lot of elegance, he said. I'm aware that what I'm about to say should probably involve more preparation. A better setting. Something that demonstrates... He stopped. Started over. My mother used to say that if you wait until everything is perfect to say the important things, you'll die with them unsaid. She said that was the particular tragedy of careful people. Abigail stopped kneading. She turned around. Luke was looking at her from across the kitchen table, and he was not the contained managing man she had met in October, and he was not the guarded man she had learned to read in the evening kitchen hours, and he was not the man who stood in doorways eating pie and looking at the sky. He was just Luke. Afraid and certain in the same moment, which is the only honest way to be when you're about to say the thing that changes everything. I'm asking you to marry me, he said. Not because the ranch needs you, not because you're useful, though you are, not because the winter worked out and the legal situation is resolved and it seems like the sensible next step. He held her gaze. Because I have not wanted a single evening to end since October. Because the house has been full in a way it hasn't been in 10 years. Because you know the difference between managing a situation and actually caring about it. And you choose caring every time, and I have been watching you choose it all winter, and I don't want to watch someone else's life be that. I want it to be mine. He paused. I want you to be mine. If you'll have me. The kitchen was completely still. Outside somewhere, Jessie was doing something that involved intermittent hammering. The rhythmic background noise of the ranch's daily life, continuing indifferent to the enormous thing happening inside the kitchen. Abigail looked at Luke Walker, at this man who had walked her 8 miles to a job interview before he'd seen her work, who had taken a second slice of pie and never explained why, who had sat at her kitchen table with his ledgers every evening for 3 months, because he could not stop himself, who had ridden beside her on the trail home from Pueblo, who had laughed in his own office about Jessie's hollering, who had said I already am with the full weight of a man who understood what the words meant. Yes, she said. Not elaborated, not qualified, not with conditions or reservations or the careful management of a woman who had learned to hold things back for her own protection. Just yes, with everything she had, the same way she had walked 8 miles and baked a pie. She didn't eat herself and knocked loud on a door she wasn't sure would open. Luke exhaled. He stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her with flour on her hands and dough on her apron. and nothing about the moment perfect, except that it was entirely real, and he put his hand against her face with the deliberate gentleness of a man who understands that some things require care, and she put her flower-covered hand over his, and that was the moment. Not the legal resolution, not the Pueblo market, not the evening outside the auction house when he said what he'd been holding since October. This moment, this kitchen, his hand, her hand, the smell of apple and cinnamon and the wood stove's warmth and the hammering outside that didn't stop because the world doesn't pause for private things, it just continues alongside them. He asked her on a Sunday. He announced it on that same Sunday at supper to all 9 men who had been present for the whole winter, who had eaten her biscuits and her pies and her soups and her Christmas morning flapjacks, who had told her about their grandmothers and their home recipes and their Sundays that used to feel different, who had ridden through foothill terrain in January because she found the trail. He stood at the head of the table and said simply, and without preamble, because he was Luke Walker, and preamble was not a thing he did. Abigail has agreed to marry me. I'd like you to know that. The table was quiet for exactly 1 second. Jesse's whoop was loud enough to be heard from the barn. Colton stood up. He didn't say anything. He extended his hand to Luke first, then turned and extended it to Abigail, and when she took it, he held it for a moment and said so quietly that only she could hear, "Well done, miss, by both of you." He sat back down. Davis looked at the sweet potato pie cooling on the rack she had made it that Sunday, as she had every Sunday for months, and then he looked at Abigail and said, "My grandmother would have liked you." It was the highest compliment he possessed, and she knew it. "Thank you, Davis," she said. Heck, the oldest hand who had been at Red Creek Ranch for 8 years and had seen things come and go, simply raised his coffee cup in a gesture that needed no translation. Abigail raised hers back. Jesse was still making noise. "Jesse," Colton said. "I'm allowed," Jesse said. "This is a significant occasion." "You're always allowed to be pleased," Colton said. "You're not always allowed to be deafening about it." "I'll work on that," Jesse said, and immediately resumed being slightly too loud about his happiness, because he was 19, and happiness at that age is a force that exceeds the available containment. The wedding was in April, when the spring had fully arrived, and the worst of the financial crisis had settled into the past, and the timber contract was signed, and the herd was building back toward what it had been. It was not an elaborate wedding. Luke was not an elaborate man, and Abigail had long since made her peace with the difference between the life her childhood had actually been and the life that belonged to women with drawing rooms and trousseau trunks. What she wanted from a wedding was not ceremony. It was truth. It was the thing being real and witnessed and permanent. Tom Garrett stood with Luke. Abigail had no family to stand with her, which was a fact she had made her peace with on the October road, somewhere between mile 3 and mile 4, before she ever reached Red Creek Ranch. But when she came out of the kitchen house on the morning of the wedding, she found the 9 men of Red Creek Ranch standing in a line in the yard in their good shirts. Every one of them, including Hector, who she had never once seen in anything other than work clothes. And Jesse had combed his hair, which she suspected had never happened in the history of his employment at the ranch. Colton stepped forward. "We thought," he said, "that since you didn't come here with family, you might want to leave this yard with some." Abigail stood in the April morning light and looked at these 9 men who had eaten her food and told her about their grandmothers and ridden with her through foothill terrain in January and straightened candles in jar lids and taken second slices of pie and said well done and good and raised coffee cups in the silence of things that don't need words. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together for exactly 1 moment. Then she said, "You all look very fine." "Jesse combed his hair," Davis said. "I can see that," she said. "It was worth the effort, Jesse." Jesse stood up slightly straighter. They walked her across the yard to where the preacher and Luke were waiting, and it was the most family a thing had felt since October. And October was a long time ago now, and the distance between who she had been at that farm fence watching strangers carry away her parents' chairs, and who she was now, was the distance of a winter and 8 miles and 1 pie and more courage than most people ever need to find out if they have. Luke watched her come across the yard with the 9 men of his ranch beside her, and what crossed his face in that moment was not something she could fully read from the distance, But when she reached him, and he looked at her directly, she saw it clearly. It was the expression of a man who has been given back something he had not known was gone. They married in April. The months that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a life that has found its shape full of work and weather, and the 10,000 small necessities of running a ranch through a territory that was still finding its own form, but underpinned by something solid, now something that didn't shift when the hard things came. And the hard things still came, because they always do. The summer brought a drought that cut the creek to half its normal flow, and Luke made the decisions he needed to make about the herd and the water allocation, and Abigail stretched the kitchen supplies with the same arithmetic she had applied since October, and the timber operation ran into a setback when 2 of the logging crew quit in August for the silver mines in Leadville. And there was a week in September when the combination of things felt like too many things at once. But there was no week that felt like October, when she had been alone on a road with nothing but a pie tin and the decision to keep walking. That particular kind of alone was done. She knew it the first time she woke in the night to the sound of a hard wind against the house and felt Luke's hand find hers in the dark, without either of them fully waking. That instinctive sleeping. Reaching that happens only between people who have been beside each other long enough that the body knows even in sleep that it is not alone. She lay there in the dark and thought this. This is what the 8 miles were for. The bakery began in the 2nd year. It started the way most of Abigail's ideas started, not with announcement, but with action. She had been teaching Jesse to bake since the previous winter, partly because Jesse had a natural instinct for it that he was too embarrassed to fully claim, and partly because a kitchen with one capable person is a kitchen that stops functioning the moment that person is unavailable. She had taught Jesse, and Jesse had taught another young hand named Marcus, who came on in the spring, and Marcus had an older sister in Crestwood, who was widowed and struggling, and Abigail invited the sister, her name was Ruth, to come to the ranch and learn. Ruth came for a month. She went home with skills she had not arrived with, and a standing invitation to return. She told 2 other women. They told more. By the 3rd year, Abigail was teaching a rotating group of 6 to 8 women from the surrounding town's widows. Mostly some young women newly arrived in the territory with no established means, the specific and practical art of making a kitchen work, regardless of what it had to work with. She taught them what her mother had taught her, that food is a language, that a kitchen run with intelligence and care is a form of power, that the ability to feed people well is never a small thing, no matter who decides it is. Luke watched this happen with the expression he had developed for things Abigail did that he hadn't anticipated but immediately understood were right. He cleared the old storehouse adjacent to the kitchen and had it properly fitted with a second wood stove and work tables. And he did this without being asked, because that was Luke. He showed love with lumber and didn't require credit for it. The pies became known throughout the county, not because Abigail advertised them. She never advertised anything. But the women she taught took the recipes home, and they baked for their families and their neighbors, and a thing that is good spreads the way. Good things spread, not through proclamation, but through the specific and irresistible testimony of taste. By the 5th year, travelers coming through the Colorado Territory on the southern routes had heard somehow that there was a ranch outside Crestwood, where if you stopped at the kitchen door and asked politely, you might be fed. Not guaranteed, not official, just known. Abigail fed everyone who came to that door. Luke never questioned it. He did once say, "You know we can't run a charitable kitchen indefinitely." And she had said, "I know, but the timber revenue is up 18% this quarter, and the herd is at 220 head, and I've worked out exactly what the kitchen can give without compromising what it needs to keep." She showed him the numbers. He looked at them. He looked at her. "I know better than to argue with your arithmetic," he said. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "You do." The recipe journal, her mother's journal, the blue-covered one with the warped cover and the pencil margin notes, and the recipe for molasses pie that said for hard times because it costs almost nothing and gives back a great deal, stayed on the shelf above the kitchen window, not behind glass, not treated as a relic. On the shelf available, consulted, annotated in the margins in Abigail's own hand, as she added what she had learned beside what her mother had known. On Thanksgiving every year, Abigail baked the apple pie. Not one of the pies she had refined over 5 years of practice and invention. The original. Her mother's recipe unchanged, made exactly as she had made it the night before she walked to Red Creek Ranch, with the cinnamon and brown sugar and the pinch of clove that the recipe never officially admitted to. The first year, it was just the two of them and the 9 ranch hands at the table. The second year, Tom and Ellen Garrett came. The third year, the table had to be extended twice. By the 5th year, the Thanksgiving table at Red Creek Ranch had become a thing that people were invited to, and people invited themselves to in equal measure. And Abigail managed the feeding of it, with the same arithmetic she applied to everything, stretching and planning and preparing weeks in advance. And the table held ranch hands and neighboring families, and the women she had taught and their children, and occasionally a traveler who had heard somehow that the door would open. At the 5th year Thanksgiving, Jesse, who was no longer 19, who had grown into the kind of young man that a few good years of being fed properly and treated with dignity will produce, sat across from a young woman from the Garrett Ranch and forgot for the duration of the meal that he was supposed to be talking to anyone else. Abigail noticed. She said nothing. She filed it away. After the meal, when the table was clearing, and the kitchen was full of voices, and the particular warmth of a room that has accomplished what a room full of food and people is supposed to accomplish. Luke came and stood beside her at the kitchen counter. He did not say anything. He just stood there shoulder to shoulder with her, looking at the room, at Jesse and the Garrett girl, at Colton, who had removed his hat for the occasion and was talking with Ellen Garrett about something that was making him use more words than he typically used in a week. At Davis, who had brought his own sweet potato pie, his grandmother's recipe, the one with nutmeg and orange peel, which he had learned from Abigail, and had now made his own, and was sitting at the end of the table, eating it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found his way back to something he thought was gone. At Hector, the oldest, who had straightened the candle in the jar lid on that first Christmas, and had never mentioned it, and had been at every Thanksgiving table since. At the room full of people who had arrived at this table by 100 different roads, some of them desperate, some of them lonely, some of them simply hungry in the particular way that has nothing to do with food. Luke put his hand over hers on the counter. She turned her hand and held his. "You know what they call this ranch now," he said. "In town." "I've heard," she said. "The ranch where every stranger is welcomed with a slice of pie," he said. He said it without irony, without the careful management that used to stand between him and the things that moved him. He just said it. "I want you to know something." She waited. "When you knocked on that door in October," he said, "I almost didn't open it." He paused. "I almost told whoever it was to come back in the morning. I was tired, and I was behind on the ledgers, and I didn't want another person standing on my porch needing something." She looked at him. "What made you open it?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. I opened it." He turned to look at her. "And there you were, with your suitcase and your pie tin, and that look on your face like you'd already decided the answer was yes before I said a word." "I had," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the thing. You walked 8 miles to a door you didn't know would open, and you weren't afraid." "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid the whole way. I just didn't let it stop me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, just for her, under the noise of the room full of people who had all come to this table one way or another, because a woman had been unafraid, "You didn't save my ranch by finding a trail in January, or by catching a date error in a legal clause, or by canning enough vegetables to carry 14 people through a hard winter." She looked at him. "You saved it," he said, "the night you left a slice of apple pie on the kitchen table for a man who had forgotten what home tasted like." The room continued around them. Jesse laughing at something Colton's unusual volubility. Davis and his grandmother's pie. Hector, watching everything with the still attention of a man who has seen enough to know what matters, and the kitchen was warm, and the table had held everyone it needed to hold, and the blue recipe journal was on the shelf above the window, and outside the Colorado Territory was settling into the deep cold of a November evening that cared nothing about the people inside. But the people inside cared about each other. And that, as Abigail Carter Walker had learned from her mother and proved on an 8-mile road in October and built into every meal she had ever made for people who needed feeding, was the whole of it. The entire irreducible truth of what a home is and what it costs and what it returns. Not land, not cattle, not the resolution of a legal clause or the outcome of a cattle market or the number of board feet in a Douglas fir stand on an eastern ridge. A home is what remains when every difficulty has been met and every hard thing has been walked through, and you are still standing in the kitchen with someone's hand in yours, in a room full of people who came here hungry and stayed because they were fed, not just with food, but with the stubborn, daily, unglamorous, absolute refusal to let the people around you go without. Abigail Walker had walked 8 miles to learn that. She had never